Chapter 31 of The Fellowship of the Frog by Edgar Wallace. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 31. The Chemical Corporation. Elk had promised to dine at Gordon's club. Dick waited for him until 20 minutes past the hour of appointment, and Elk had neither telephoned nor put in an appearance. At 25 minutes past, he arrived in a hurry. "Good Lord," he gasped, looking at the clock. "I had no idea it was so late, Captain. I must buy a watch." They went into the dining hall together, and Elk felt that he was entering a church. There was such solemn dignity about the stately room, with its prim and silent diners. "It certainly has Heron's beat in the matter of Dickie Orme." "I don't know that, gentlemen," said the puzzled Dick. "Oh, do you mean decorum?" "Yes, this is a little more sedate." "What kept you, Elk?" "I'm not complaining, but when you're not on time, I worry as to what has happened to you." "Nothing has happened to me," said Elk, nodding pleasantly to the embarrassed club waiter. "Only we had an inquiry in Gloucester. I thought we'd struck another frog case, but the 2 men involved had no frog marks." "Who are they?" "Fennon is one. He's the man that's dead." "A murder?" "I think so," said Elk, spearing a sardine. "I think he was thoroughly dead when they found him at Ibley Copse. They pinched the man who was with him. He was drunk. Apparently they'd been to Laverstock and had quarreled and fought in the bar of the Red Lion. The police were informed later and telephoned through to the next village to tell the constable to keep his eye on these two fellows. But they hadn't passed through, so they sent a bicycle patrol to look for them. There's been 1 or 2 housebreakings in that neighborhood." "And they found them?" Elk nodded. "One man dead and the other man bottled. Apparently they'd quarreled, and the drunken gentleman shot the other. They're both tramps or of that class. Identification marks on them show they've come from Wales. They slept at Bath last night at Rooney's lodging house, and that's all that's known of them. Carter is the murderer. They've taken him to Gloucester jail. It's a very simple case, and the Gloucester police gave a haughty smile at the idea of calling in headquarters. It is a crime anyway. That is up to the intellectual level of the country police." Dick's lips twitched. "Just now, the country police are passing unpleasant comments on our intelligence," he said. "Let 'em," scoffed Elk. "Those people are certainly entitled to their simple pleasures, and I'd be the last to deny them the right. I saw John Bennett in town tonight, at Paddington this time. I'm always knocking against him at railway stations. That man is certainly a traveler. He had his old camera with him, too. I spoke to him this time, and he's full of trouble. Went to sleep, pushed the gadget in his dreams, and wasted a fortune in film. But he's pleased with himself, and I don't wonder. I saw a note about his pictures the other day in one of the newspapers. He looks like turning into a first-class success." "I sincerely hope so," said Dick quietly, and something in his tone made his guest look up. "Which reminds me," he said, "that I had a note from friend Johnson asking me whether I knew Ray Bennett's address. He said he called up at Heron's club, but Ray hadn't been there for days. He wants to give him a job. Quite a big position, too. There's a lot that's very fine in Johnson." "Did you give the address?" Elk nodded. "I gave him the address, and I called on the boy, but he's out of town. Went out a few days ago and is not likely to be back for a fortnight. It will be too bad if he loses this job. I think Johnson was sore with the side young Bennett put on, but he doesn't seem to bear any malice. Perhaps there's another influence at work," he said significantly. Dick knew that he meant Ella, but did not accept the opening. They adjourned to the smoke room after dinner, and whilst Elk puffed luxuriously at one of his host's best cigars, Dick wrote a brief note to the girl, who had been in his thoughts all that day. It was an unnecessary note, as such epistles are liable to be, but it might have had, as its excuse, the news that he had heard from Elk, only for some reason he never thought of that until after the letter was finished and sealed. When he turned to his companion, Elk propounded a theory. "I sent a man up to look at some chemical works. It's a fake company, less than a dozen hands employed, and those only occasionally. But it has a very powerful electrical installation. It is an old poison gas factory. The present company bought it for a song, and 2 fellows we are holding were the nominal purchasers." "Where is it?" asked Dick. between Newbury and Didcot. I found out a great deal about them for a curious reason. It happens that there was some arrangement between the factory, when it was under government control, that it should make an annual contribution to the Newbury Fire Brigade, and in taking over the property, the company also took over that contract, which they're now trying to get out of, for the charge is a stiff one. They told the Newbury Brigade, in so many words, to disconnect the factory from their alarm service, but the Newbury Brigade, being on a good thing and having lost money by the arrangement during the war, refused to cancel the contract, which has still 3 years to run. Dick was not interested in the slightest degree in the quarrel between the chemical factory and the fire brigade. Later, he had cause to be thankful the conversation had drifted into such a prosaic channel, but this he could not foresee. "Yes, very remarkable," he said absent-mindedly. A fortnight after the disappearance from town of Ray Bennett, Elk accepted the invitation of the American to lunch. It was an invitation often given, and only accepted now because there had arisen in Elk's mind a certain doubt about Joshua Broad, a doubt which he wished to mold into assurance. Broad was waiting for the detective when he arrived, and Elk, to whom time had no particular significance, arrived 10 minutes late. 10 minutes after 1, said Elk. "I can't keep on time anyhow. There's been a lot of trouble at the office over the new safe they've got me. Something's wrong with it, and even the lockmaker doesn't know what it is." "Can't you open it?" "That's just it. I can't. And I've got to get some papers out today that are mighty important," said Elk. "I was wondering as I came along whether, having such a wide experience of the criminal classes, you ever heard any way by which it could be opened. It needs a proper engineer. And if I remember rightly, you told me you were an engineer once, Mr. Broad." "Your memory is at fault," said the other calmly, as he unfolded his napkin and regarded the detective with a twinkle in his eye. "Safe opening is not my profession." "And I never dreamt it was," said Elk heartily. "But it has always struck me that the Americans are much more clever with their hands than the people in this country, and I thought you might be able to give me a word of advice." "Maybe I'll introduce you to my pet burglar," said Broad gravely, and they laughed together. "What do you think of me?" asked the American unexpectedly. "I'm not expecting you to give your view of my character or personal appearance, but what do you think I am doing in London, dodging around, doing nothing but a whole lot of amateur police work?" "I've never given you much thought," said Elk untruthfully. "Being an American, I expect you to be out of the ordinary." "Flatterer," murmured Mr. Broad. "I wouldn't go so far as to flatter you," protested Elk. "Flattery is repugnant to me anyway." He unfolded an evening newspaper he had brought. "Looking for those tailless amphibians?" "Eh?" Elk looked up puzzled. "Frogs," explained the other. "No, I'm not exactly looking for frogs, though I understand a few of them are looking for me. As a matter of fact, there's very little in the newspaper about those interesting animals, but there's going to be." "When?" The question was a challenge. "When we get frog number 1. Mr. Broad crumpled a roll in his hand and broke it. "Do you think you'll get number 1 before I get him?" he asked quietly, and Elk looked across the table over his spectacles. "I've been wondering that for a long time," he said, and for a second their eyes met. "Do you think I shall get him?" asked Broad. "If all my speculations and surmises are what they ought to be, I think you will," said Elk, and suddenly his attention was focused upon a paragraph. "Quick work," he said. "We beat you Americans in that respect." "In what respect is that?" asked Broad. "I am sufficient of a cosmopolitan to agree that there are many things in England which you do better than we in America." Elk looked up to the ceiling. 15 days, he said. Of course, he just managed to catch the assizes. "Who's that?" "That man Carter, who shot a tramp near Gloucester," said Elk. "What has happened to him?" asked the other. "He was sentenced to death this morning," said the detective. Joshua Broad frowned. "Sentenced to death this morning? Carter, you say? I didn't read the story of the murder." "There was nothing complicated about it," said Elk. 2 tramps had a quarrel. I think they got drinking. And one shot the other and was found lying in a drunken sleep by the dead man's side. There's practically no evidence. The prisoner refused to make any statement or to instruct a lawyer. It must have been one of the shortest murder trials on record. "Where did this happen?" asked Broad, arousing himself from the reverie into which he had fallen. Near Gloucester, there was little in the paper. It wasn't a really interesting murder. There was no woman in it, so far as the evidence went, and who cared a cent about two tramps? He folded the paper and put it down, and for the rest of the meal was engaged in a much more fascinating discussion, the police methods of the United States, on which matter Mr. Broad was apparently something of an authority. The object of the American's invitation was very apparent. Again and again he attempted to turn the conversation to the man under arrest, and as skillfully as he introduced the subject of Balder, did Elk turn the discussion back to the merits of the third degree as a method of crime detection. "Elk, you're as close as an oyster," said Broad, beckoning a waiter to bring his bill. "And yet I could tell you almost as much about this man Balder as you know." "Tell me the prison he's in?" demanded Elk. "He's in Pentonville, Ward 7, Cell 84, said the other immediately, and Elk sat bolt upright. "And you needn't trouble to shift him to somewhere else just because I happen to know his exact location. I should be just as well informed if he was at Brixton, Wandsworth, Holloway, Wormwood Scrubs, Maidstone, or Chelmsford." End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of The Fellowship of the Frog by Edgar Wallace. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 32. In Gloucester Prison. There is a cell in Gloucester Prison, the end cell in a long corridor of the old building. Next door is another cell, which is never occupied, for an excellent reason. That in which Ray Bennett sat was furnished more expensively than any other in the prison. There was an iron bedstead, a plain deal table, a comfortable Windsor chair, and two other chairs, on one of which, night and day, sat a warder. The walls were distempered pink. One big window near the ceiling, heavily barred, covered with tough and opaque glass, admitted light, which was augmented all the time by an electric globe in the arched ceiling. 3 doors led from the cell, one into the corridor, the other into a little annex fitted with a washing bowl and a bath, the third into the unoccupied cell, which had a wooden floor and in the center of the floor a square trap. Ray Bennett did not know then how close he was to the death house, and if he had known, he would not have cared, for death was the least of the terrors which oppressed him. He had awakened from his drugged sleep to find himself in the cell of a country lockup, and had heard, bemused, the charge of murder that had been made against him. He had no clear recollection of what had happened. All that he knew was that he had hated Lou Brady and that he had wanted to kill him. After that he had a recollection of walking with him and sitting down somewhere. They told him that Brady was dead, and that the weapon with which the murder was committed had been found in his hand. Ray had racked his brains in an effort to remember whether he had a revolver or not. He must have had. And of course he had been drugged. They had had whiskey at the Red Lion, and Lou must have said something about Lola, and he had shot him. It was strange that he did not think longingly of Lola. His love for her had gone. He thought of her as he thought of Lou Brady, as something unimportant that belonged to the past. All that mattered now was that his father and Ella should not know. At all costs the disgrace must be kept from them. He had waited in a fever of impatience for the trial to end, so that he might get away from the public gaze. Fortunately, the murder was not of sufficient interest even for the ubiquitous press photographers. He wanted to be done with it all, to go out of life unknown. The greatest tragedy that could occur to him was that he should be identified. He dared not think of Ella or his father. He was Jim Carter, without parents or friends, and if he died as Jim Carter, he must spend his last days of life as Jim Carter. He was not frightened. He had no fear. His only nightmare was that he should be recognized. The warder who was with him, and who was not supposed to speak to him, had told him that, by the law, 3 clear Sundays must elapse between his sentence and execution. The chaplain visited him every day, and the governor. A tap at the cell door told him it was the governor's hour, and he rose as the gray-haired official came in. "Any complaints, Carter?" "None, sir." "Is there anything you want?" "No, sir." The governor looked at the table. The writing pad, which had been placed for the condemned prisoner's use, had not been touched. You have no letters to write? I suppose you can write." "Yes, sir. I've no letters to write." "What are you, Carter? You're not an ordinary tramp. You're better educated than that class." "I'm an ordinary tramp, sir," said Ray quietly. "Have you all the books you need?" Ray nodded, and the governor went out. Every day came these inevitable inquiries. Sometimes the governor made reference to his friends, but he grew tired of asking questions about the unused blotting pad. Ray Bennett had reached the stage of sane understanding where he did not even regret. It was inevitable. He had been caught up in the machinery of circumstance and must go slowly round to the crashing place. Every morning and afternoon he paced the square exercise yard, watched by 3 men in uniform, and jealously screened from the observation of other prisoners, and his serenity amazed all who saw him. He was caught up in the wheel and must go the full round. He could even smile at himself, observe his own vanity with the eye of an outsider. And he could not weep, because there was nothing left to weep about. He was already a dead man. Nobody troubled to organize a reprieve for him. He was too uninteresting a murderer. The newspapers did not flame into headlines demanding a new trial. Fashionable lawyers would not foregather to discuss an appeal. He had murdered. He must die. Once, when he was washing and was about to put his hand in the water, he saw the reflection of his face staring back at him, and he did not recognize himself, for his beard had grown weedily. He laughed, and when the wondering warders looked at him, he said, "I'm only now beginning to cultivate a sense of humor. I've left it rather late, haven't I?" He could have had visitors, could have seen anybody he wished, but derived a strange satisfaction from his isolation. He had done with all that was artificial and emotional in life. Lola? He thought of her again and shook his head. She was very pretty. He wondered what she would do now that Lou was dead, what she was doing at that moment. He thought, too, of Dick Gordon, remembered that he liked him that day when Dick had given him a ride in his big Rolls. How queerly far off that seemed. And yet it could have been only a few months ago. One day the governor came in a more ceremonial style, and with him was a gentleman whom Ray remembered having seen in the courthouse on the day of the trial. It was the undersheriff, and there was an important communication to be made. The governor had to clear his throat twice. "Carter," he said a little unsteadily, "the Secretary of State has informed me that he sees no reason for interfering with the course of the law. The High Sheriff has fixed next Wednesday morning at 8 o'clock as the date and hour of your execution." Ray inclined his head. "Thank you, sir," he said. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of The Fellowship of the Frog by Edgar Wallace. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 33. The Frog of the Night. John Bennett emerged from the woodshed, which he had converted into a dark room, bearing a flat square box in either hand. "Don't talk to me for a minute, Ella," he said as she rose from her knees. She was weeding her own pet garden. "Or I shall get these blamed things mixed. This one," he shook his right hand, "is a picture of trout, and it is a great picture," he said enthusiastically. "The man who runs the trout farm let me take it through the glass side of the trench, and it was a beautifully sunny day." "What is the other one, Daddy?" she asked, and John Bennett pulled a face. "That is the dud," he said regretfully. 500 feet of good film gone west. I may have got a picture by accident, but I can't afford to have it developed on the off chance. I'll keep it by, and one day when I'm rolling in money, I'll go to the expense of satisfying my curiosity." He took the boxes into the house and turned round to his stationery rack to find 2 adhesive labels, and had finished writing them when Dick Gordon's cheery voice came through the open window. He rose eagerly and went out to him. "Well, Captain Gordon, did you get it?" he asked. "I got it," said Dick solemnly, waving an envelope. "You're the first cinematographer that has been allowed in the zoological gardens, and I had to crawl to the powers that be to secure the permission." The pale face of John Bennett flushed with pleasure. "It is a tremendous thing," he said. "The zoo has never been put on the pictures, and Selinsky has promised me a fabulous sum for the film if I can take it." "The fabulous sum is in your pocket, Mr. Bennet," said Dick, "and I am glad that you mentioned it." "I am under the impression you mentioned it first," said John Bennet. Ella did not remember having seen her father smile before. "Perhaps I did," said Dick cheerfully. "I knew you were interested in animal photography." He did not tell John Bennet that it was Ella who had first spoken about the difficulties of securing zoo photographs and her father's inability to obtain the necessary permission. John Bennet went back to his labeling with a lighter heart than he had borne for many a day. He wrote the 2 slips, wetted the gum, and hesitated. Then he laid down the papers and went into the garden. "Ella, do you remember which of those boxes had the trout in?" "The one in your right hand, Daddy," she said. "I thought so," he said, and went to finish his work. It was only after the boxes were labeled that he had any misgivings. Where had he stood when he put them down? On which side of the table? Then, with a shrug, he began to wrap the trout picture, and they saw him carrying it under his arm to the village post office. "No news of Ray?" asked Dick. The girl shook her head. "What did your father think?" "He doesn't talk about Ray, and I haven't emphasized the fact that it is such a long time since I had a letter." They were strolling through the garden toward the little summer house that John Bennet had built in the days when Ray was a schoolboy. "Have you not heard?" she asked. "I credit you with an omniscience which perhaps isn't deserved. You have not found the man who killed Mr. Maitland?" "No," said Dick. "I don't expect we shall until we catch Frog himself." "Will you?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "Yes, he can't go on forever. Even Elk is taking a cheerful view." "Ella," he asked suddenly, "are you the kind of person who keeps a promise?" "Yes," she said in surprise. "In all circumstances, if you make a promise, do you keep it?" "Why, of course. If I do not think I can keep it, I do not make a promise. Why?" "Well, I want you to make me a promise, and to keep it," he said. She looked past him, and then, "It depends what the promise is." "I want you to promise to be my wife," said Dick Gordon. Her hand lay in his, and she did not draw it from him. "It is very businesslike, isn't it?" she said, biting her unruly underlip. "Will you promise?" She looked round at him, tears in her eyes, though her lips were smiling, and he caught her in his arms. John Bennet waited a long time for his lunch that day. Going out to see where his daughter was, he met Dick, and in a few words Dick Gordon told him all. He saw the pain in the man's face, and dropped his hand upon the broad shoulder. "Ella has promised me, and she will not go back on her promise. Whatever happens, whatever she learns." The man raised his eyes to the other's face. "Will you go back on your promise?" he asked huskily. "Whatever you learn?" "I know," said Dick simply. Ella Bennet walked on air that day. A new and splendid color had come into her life, a tremendous certainty which banished all the fears and doubts she had felt, a light which revealed delightful vistas. Her father went over to Dorking that afternoon, and came back hurriedly, wearing that strange look which it hurt her to see. "I shall have to go to town, dearie," he said. "There's been a letter waiting for me for 2 days. I've been so absorbed in my picture work that I had forgotten I had any other responsibility." He did not look for her in the garden to kiss her goodbye, and when she came back to the house he was gone, and in such a hurry that he had not taken his camera with him. Ella did not mind being alone. In the days when Ray was at home, she had spent many nights in the cottage by herself, and the house was on the main road. She made some tea and sat down to write to Dick, though she told herself reprovingly that he hadn't been gone more than 2 or 3 hours. Nevertheless, she wrote, for the spirit of logic avoids the lover. There was a postal box 100 yards up the road. It was a bright night, and people were standing at their cottage gates, gossiping as she passed. The letter dropped in the box. She came back to the cottage, went inside, locked and bolted the door, and sat down with a work-basket by her side to fill in the hour which separated her from bedtime. So working, her mind was completely occupied, to the exclusion of all other thoughts, by Dick Gordon. Once or twice the thought of her father and Ray strayed across her mind, but it was to Dick she returned. The only illumination in the cozy dining room was a shaded kerosene lamp, which stood on the table by her side and gave her sufficient light for her work. All outside the range of the lamp was shadow. She had finished darning a pair of her father's socks and had laid down the needle with a happy sigh when her eyes went to the door leading to the kitchen. It was ajar, and it was opening slowly. For a moment she sat paralyzed with terror, and then leapt to her feet. "Who's there?" she called. There came into the shadowy doorway a figure, the very sight of which choked the scream in her throat. It looked tall, by reason of the tightly fitting black coat it wore. The face and head were hidden behind a hideous mask of rubber and mica. The reflection of the lamp shone on the big goggles and filled them with a baleful fire. "Don't scream, don't move," said the masked man, and his voice sounded hollow and far away. "I will not hurt you." "Who are you?" she managed to gasp. "I am the frog," said the stranger. For an eternity, as it seemed, she stood helpless, incapable of movement, and it was he who spoke. "How many men love you, Ella Bennett?" he asked. "Gordon and Johnson, and the frog, who loves you most of all." He paused as though he expected her to speak, but she was incapable of answering him. Men work for women, and they murder for women, and behind all that they do, respectably or unrespectably, there is a woman, said the frog. "And you are that woman for me, Ella." "Who are you?" she managed to say. "I am the frog," he replied again, "and you shall know my name when I have given it to you. I want you. Not now," he raised his hand as he saw the terror rising in her face. "You shall come to me willingly." "You're mad," she cried. "I do not know you. How can I? Oh, it's too wicked to suggest. Please go away." "I will go presently," said the frog. "Will you marry me, Ella?" She shook her head. "Will you marry me, Ella?" he asked again. "No." She had recovered her calm and something of her self-possession. "I will give you... If you gave me all the money there was in the world, I would not marry you," she said. "I will give you something more precious." His voice was softer, scarcely audible. "I will give you a life." She thought he was speaking of Dick Gordon. "I will give you the life of your brother." For a second the room spun round and she clutched a chair to keep her feet. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I will give you the life of your brother who is lying in Gloucester jail under sentence of death," said the frog. With a supreme effort, Ella guided herself to a chair and sat down. "My brother?" she said dully. "Under sentence of death?" "Today is Monday," said the frog. "On Wednesday he dies. Give me your word that when I send for you, you will come, and I will save him." "How can you save him?" The question came mechanically. "A man has made a confession, a man named Gill, a half-witted fellow who thinks he killed Lou Brady." "Brady?" she gasped. The frog nodded. "It isn't true," she breathed. "You're lying. You're telling me this to frighten me." "Will you marry me?" he asked. "Never, never!" she cried. "I would rather die. You are lying to me." "When you want me, send for me," said the frog. "Put in your window a white card, and I will save your brother." She half lay on the table, her head upon her folded arms. "It's not true. It's not true," she muttered. There was no reply, and looking up she saw that the room was empty. Staggering to her feet, she went out into the kitchen. The kitchen door was open, and peering into the dark garden, she saw no sign of the man. She had strength to bolt the door and dragged herself up to her room and to her bed, and then she fainted. Daylight showed in the windows when she sat up. She was painfully weary, her eyes were red with weeping, her head was in a whirl. It had been a night of horror, and it was not true, it could not be true. She had heard of no murder, and if there had been, it could not be Ray. She would have known. Ray would have sent for her father. She dragged her aching limbs to the bathroom and turned the cold water tap. Half an hour later she was sane, and looking at her experience dispassionately. Ray was alive. The man had tried to frighten her. Who was he? She shivered. She saw only one solution to her terrible problem, and after she made herself a cup of tea, she dressed and walked down into the town, in time to catch an early train. What other thought came to her, she never dreamt for one moment of surrender, never so much as glanced at the window where a white card could be placed, might save the life of her brother. In her heart of hearts, she knew that this man would not have come to her with such a story unless it was well-founded. That was not the frog's way. What advantage would he gain if he had invented this tragedy? Nevertheless, she did not even look for a white card, or think of its possible use. Dick was at breakfast when she arrived, and a glance at her face told him that she brought bad news. "Don't go, Mr. Relk," she said as the inspector pushed back his chair. "You must know this." As briefly as she could, she narrated the events of the night before, and Dick listened with rising wrath until she came to the climax of the story. "Ray under sentence?" he said incredulously. "Of course it isn't true." "Where did he say the boy was?" asked Elk. "In Gloucester Prison." In their presence, her reserve had melted and she was near to tears. "Gloucester Prison?" repeated Elk slowly. "There is a man there under sentence of death, a man named—" he strove to remember. "Carter," he said at last. "That is it. Carter, a tramp. He killed another tramp named Feenan." "Of course it isn't Ray," said Dick, laying his hand on hers. "This brute tried to frighten you. When did he say the execution had been fixed for?" "Tomorrow." She was weeping, now that the tension had relaxed. It seemed that she had reached the reserve of her strength. "Ray is probably on the continent," Dick soothed her, and here Elk thought it expedient and delicate to steal silently forth. He was not as convinced as Gordon that the frog had made a bluff. No sooner was he in his office than he rang for his new clerk. "Records," he said briefly. "I want particulars of a man named Carter, now lying under sentence of death in Gloucester Prison. Photograph, fingerprints, and record of the crime." The man was gone 10 minutes and returned with a small portfolio. "No photograph has been received yet, sir," he said. "In murder cases, we do not get the full records from the county police until after the execution." Elk cursed the county police fluently and addressed himself to the examination of the dossier. That told him little or nothing. The height and weight of the man tallied, he guessed, with Ray's. There were no body marks, and the description, "slight beard." He sat bolt upright. Slight beard! Ray Bennett had been growing a beard for some reason. He remembered that Broad had told him this. "Pshaw," he said, throwing down the fingerprint card. "It is impossible." It was impossible, and yet... He drew a telegraph pad toward him and wrote a wire. "Governor, H.M. Prison, Gloucester. Very urgent. Sent by special messenger prison photograph of James Carter under sentence of death in your prison to headquarters records. Messenger must leave by first train. Very urgent." He took the liberty of signing it with the name of the chief commissioner. The telegram dispatched, he returned to his scrutiny of the description sheet, and presently he saw a remark which he had overlooked. "Vaccination marks on right forearm." That was unusual. People are usually vaccinated on the left arm, a little below the shoulder. He made a note of this fact and turned to the work that was waiting for him. At noon a wire arrived from Gloucester saying that the photograph was on its way. That, at least, was satisfactory, though even if it proved to be Ray, what could be done? In his heart, Elk prayed most fervently that the frog had bluffed. Just before 1, Dick telephoned him and asked him to lunch with them at the Auto Club, an invitation which in any circumstances was not to be refused, for Elk had a passion for visiting other people's clubs. When he arrived, on this occasion strictly on time, he found the girl in a calm, even a cheerful mood, and his quick eye detected upon her finger a ring of surprising brilliance that he had not seen before. Dick Gordon had made very good use of his spare time that morning. "I feel I'm neglecting my business, Elk," he said after he had led them into the palatial dining room of the Auto, and had found a cushion for the girl's back, and had placed her chair exactly where it was least comfortable. "But I guess you've got through the morning without feeling my loss." "I certainly have," said Elk. "A very interesting morning. There is a smallpox scare in the East End," he went on, "and I've heard some talk at headquarters of having the whole staff vaccinated. If there's one thing that I do not approve of, it is vaccination. At my time of life, I ought to be immune from any germ that happens to be going around." The girl laughed. "Poor Mr. Elk. I sympathize with you. Ray and I had a dreadful time when we were vaccinated about 5 years ago during the big epidemic, although I didn't have so bad a time as Ray. And neither of us had such an experience as the majority of victims because we had an excellent doctor, with unique views on vaccination. She pulled back the sleeve of her blouse and showed 3 tiny scars on the underside of the right forearm. The doctor said he would put it where it wouldn't show. Isn't that a good idea? Yes, said Elk slowly. And did he vaccinate your brother the same way? She nodded, and then, What is the matter, Mr. Elk? I swallowed an olive stone, said Elk. I wonder somebody doesn't start cultivating olives without stones. He looked out of the window. You've got a pretty fine day for your visit, Miss Bennet, he said, and launched forth into a rambling condemnation of the English climate. It seemed hours to Elk before the meal was finished. The girl was going back to Gordon's house to look at catalogues which Dick had ordered to be sent to Harley Terrace by telephone. You won't be coming to the office? Asked Elk. No. Do you think it is necessary? I wanted to see you for 10 minutes, drawled the other, perhaps a quarter of an hour. Come back to the house. Well, I wasn't thinking of coming back to the house, said Elk. Perhaps you've got a ladies' drawing room. I remember seeing one as I came through the marble hall, and Miss Bennet would not mind. Why, of course not, she said. If I'm in the way, I'll do anything you wish. Show me your ladies' drawing room. When Dick had come back, the detective was smoking, his elbows on the table, his thin brown hands clasped under his chin, and he was examining, with the eye of a connoisseur, the beautifully carved ceiling. What's the trouble, Elk? Said Gordon as he sat down. The man under sentence of death is Ray Bennet, said Elk without preliminary. End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of The Fellowship of the Frog by Edgar Wallace. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 34. The Photoplay. Dick's face went white. How do you know this? Well, there's a photograph coming along. He will be in London this afternoon, but I needn't see that. This man under sentence has 3 vaccination marks on the right forearm. There was dead silence. I wondered why you turned the talk to vaccination, said Dick quietly. I ought to have known there was something in it. What can we do? I'll tell you what you can't do, said Elk. You can't let that girl know. For good and sufficient reasons, Ray Bennet has decided not to reveal his identity, and he must pass out. You're going to have a rotten afternoon, Captain Gordon, said Elk gently, and I'd rather be me than you. But you've got to keep up your light-hearted chatter, or that young woman is going to guess that something is wrong. My God, how dreadful, said Dick in a low voice. Yes, it is, admitted Elk, and we can do nothing. We've got to accept it as a fact that he's guilty. If you thought any other way, it would drive you mad. And even if he was as innocent as you or I, what chance have we of getting an inquiry or stopping the sentence being carried into execution? Poor John Bennet, said Dick in a hushed voice. If you're starting to get sentimental, snarled Elk, blinking furiously, and going into a more practical atmosphere. Good afternoon. Wait, I can't face this girl for a moment. Come back to the house with me. Elk hesitated and then grudgingly agreed. Elk could not guess, from their demeanor, the horror that was in the minds of these men. Elk fell back upon history and dates, a prolific and favorite subject. Thank heaven those catalogues have arrived, said Dick, as with a sigh of relief he saw the huge pile of literature on his study table. Why, thank heaven, she smiled. Because his conscience is pricking him and he wants an excuse for working. Elk came to the rescue. The strain was one which even he found almost insupportable, and when after a pleading glance at the other, Dick nodded, he got up with a sense of holiday. I'll be going now, Miss Bennet, he said. I expect you'll be busy all the afternoon furnishing your cottage. I must come down and see it, he went on, wilfully dense, though it struck me that there wouldn't be much room for new furniture at Maitri. So far he got when he heard voices in the hall, the excited voice of a woman, shrill, insistent, hysterical. Before Dick could get to the door, it was flung open, and Lola rushed in. Gordon! Gordon! Oh, my God! She sobbed. Do you know? Hush, said Dick, but the girl was beside herself. They've got Ray! They're going to hang him! Lou's dead!" The mischief was done. Ella came slowly to her feet, rigid with fear. "My brother?" she asked, and then Lola saw her for the first time and nodded. "I found out," she sobbed. "I had a suspicion, and I've got a photograph of Feenan. I knew it was Lou at once, and I guessed the rest. The frog did it. He planned it. Months in advance, he planned it. I'm not sorry about Lou. I swear I'm not sorry about Lou. It's the boy. I sent him to his death, Gordon." And then she broke into a fit of hysterical sobbing. "Put her out," said Gordon, and Elk lifted the helpless girl in his arms and carried her into the dining room. "True," Ella whispered the word, and Dick nodded. "I'm afraid it's true, Ella." She sat down slowly. "I wonder where I can find Father," she said, as calmly as though she were discussing some everyday event. "You can do nothing. He knows nothing. Do you think it is kind to tell him?" She searched his face wonderingly. "I think you're right. Of course you're right, Dick. I'm sure you're right. Father mustn't know. Couldn't I see him? Ray, I mean?" Dick shook his head. "Ella, if Ray has kept silent to save you from this, all his forbearance, all his courage, will be wasted if you go to him." Again her lips drooped. "Yes, it is good of you to think of me." She put her hand on his, and he felt no tremor. "I don't know what I can do," she said. "It is so stunning. What can I do?" "You can do nothing, my dear." His arm went round her, and her tired head fell upon his shoulder. "No, I can do nothing," she whispered. Elk came in. "A telegram for Miss Bennet," he said. "The messenger just arrived with it. Been redirected from Horsham, I expect." Dick took the wire. "Open it, please," said the girl. "It may be from Father." He tore open the envelope. The telegram ran, "Have printed your picture. Cannot understand the murder. Were you trying to take photo play? Come and see me. Selensky House, Wardour Street." "What does it mean?" she asked. "It is Greek to me," said Dick. "Cannot understand murder. Has your father been trying to take photo plays?" "No, dear, I'm sure he hasn't. He would have told me." "What photographs did your father take?" "It was a picture of trout," she said, gathering her scattered thoughts. "But he took another picture, in his sleep. He was in the country waiting for a badger and dozed. He must have pressed the starter. He thought that picture was a failure. It can't be the trout. It doesn't mention the trout. It must be the other." "We will go to Wardour Street." It was Elk who spoke so definitely. Elk who called a cab and hustled the two people into it. When they arrived at Wardour Street, Mr. Selensky was out at lunch, and nobody knew anything whatever about the film or had authority to show it. For an hour and a half they waited, fuming, in that dingy office, whilst the messengers went in search of Selensky. He arrived at last, a polite and pleasant little Hebrew who was all apologies, though no apology was called for, since he had not expected his visitors. "Yes, it is a curious picture," he said. "Your father misses a very good amateur. In fact, he's a professional now. And if it is true that he can get those zoo photographs, he ought to be in the first rank of nature photographers." They followed him up a flight of stairs into a big room across which were row upon row of chairs. Facing them as they sat was a small white screen, and behind them an iron partition with 2 square holes. "This is our theater," he explained. "You've no idea whether your father is trying to take motion pictures, photoplays? If he is, then this scene was pretty well acted. But I can't understand why he did it. It's labeled trout in a pond or something of the sort, but there are no trout here, and there is no pond either." There was a click and the room went black, and then there was shown on the screen a picture which showed in the foreground a stretch of gray sandy soil and the dark opening of a burrow, out of which peeped a queer-looking animal. "That's a badger," explained Mr. Selensky. "It looked very promising up to there, and then I don't know what he did. You'll see he changed the elevation of the camera." As he spoke, the picture jerked round a little to the right, as though it had been pulled violently, and they were looking upon 2 men, obviously tramps. One was sitting with his head on his hands, the other close by him was pouring out whiskey into a container. "That's Lou Brady," whispered Elk fiercely, and at that moment the other man looked up, and Ella Bennet uttered a cry. "It is Ray! Oh, Dick, it is Ray!" There was no question of it. The light beard he wore melted into the shadows which the strong sunlight cast. They saw Brady offer him a drink, saw him toss it down and throw the cup back to the man, watched him as his arms stretched in a yawn, and then saw him curl up to sleep, lie back, and Lou Brady standing over him. The prostrate figure turned onto its face, and Lou, stooping, put something in his pocket. They caught the reflection of glass. "The flask," said Elk. And then the figure standing in the center of the picture spun round. There walked toward him a man. His face was invisible. Never once during that period did he turn his face to that eager audience. They saw his arm go up quickly, saw the flash of the two shots, watched breathless, spellbound, horrified, the tragedy that followed. The man stooped and placed the pistol by the side of the sleeping Ray, and then as he turned, the screen went white. "That's the end of the picture," said Mr. Selensky, "and what it means, heaven knows." "He's innocent! Dick, he's innocent!" the girl cried wildly. "Don't you see? It was not he who fired." She was half mad with grief and horror, and Dick caught her firmly by the shoulders, the dumbfounded Selensky gaping at the scene. "You are going back to my house and you will read. Do you hear, Ella? You're to do nothing until you hear from me. You are not to go out, and you are to sit and read. I don't care what you read, the Bible, the police news, anything you like, but you must not think of this business. Elk and I will do all that is possible." She mastered her wild terror and tried to smile. "I know you will," she said between her chattering teeth. "Get me to your house, please." He left Elk to go to Fleet Street to collect every scrap of information about the murder he could from the newspaper offices, and brought the girl back to Harley Terrace. As he got out of the cab, he saw a man waiting on the steps. It was Joshua Broad. One glance at his face told Dick that he knew of the murder, and he guessed the source. He waited in the hall until Dick had put the girl in the study and had collected every illustrated newspaper, every book he could find. "Lola told me of this business." "I guessed so," said Dick. "Do you know anything about it?" "I knew these two men started out in the disguise of tramps," said Broad, "but I understood they were going north. This is frog work. Why? I don't know." "Yes, I do," Dick said suddenly. "The frog came to Miss Bennet last night and asked her to marry him, promising that he would save her brother if she agreed. But it can hardly be that he planned this diabolical trick to that end." "To no other end," said Broad coolly. "You don't know Frog, Gordon. The man is a strategist, probably the greatest strategist in the world. Can I do anything?" "I would ask you to stay and keep Miss Bennet amused," Dick began. "I think you might do worse," said the American quietly. Ella looked up with a look of pain as the visitor entered the room. She felt that she could not endure the presence of a stranger at this moment, that she would break under any new strain, and she glanced at Dick imploringly. "If you don't want me to stay," Miss Bennet smiled Broad, "well, I'll just go as soon as you tell me. But I have one piece of information to pass to you, and it is this, that your brother will not die." His eyes met Dick Gordon's, and the prosecutor bit his lip to restrain the cry that came involuntarily. "Why?" she asked eagerly, but neither of the men could tell her. Dick telephoned to the garage for his car, the very machine that Ray Bennet had driven the first day they had met. His first call was at the office of the public prosecutor, and to him he stated the facts. "It is a most remarkable story, and I can do nothing, of course. You'd better see the Secretary of State at once, Gordon." "Is the House of Commons sitting, sir?" "No, I've an idea that the Secretary, who is the only man that can do anything for you, is out of town. He may be on the continent. I'm not sure. There was a conference at San Remo last week, and I've a dim notion that he went there." Dick's heart almost stood still. "Is there nobody else at the Home Office who could help?" "There is the Undersecretary. You'd better see him." The public prosecutor's department was housed in the Home Office building, and Dick went straight away in search of the responsible official. The permanent secretary, to whom he explained the circumstances, shook his head. "I'm afraid we can do nothing now, Gordon," he said, "and the Secretary of State is in the country and very ill." "Where is the Undersecretary?" asked Dick desperately. "He's at San Remo." How far out of town is Mr. Whitby's house? The official considered. About 30 miles, this side of Tunbridge Wells, and Dick wrote the address on a slip of paper. Half an hour later, a long yellow Rolls was flying across Westminster Bridge, threading the traffic with a recklessness which brought the hearts of the hardened chauffeurs to their mouths. And 40 minutes after he had left Whitehall, Dick was speeding up an elm-bordered avenue to the home of the Secretary of State. The butler who met him could give him no encouragement. "I'm afraid Mr. Whitby cannot see you, sir. He has a very bad attack of gout, and the doctors have told him that he mustn't touch any kind of business whatsoever." "This is a matter of life and death," said Dick, "and I must see him. Or failing him, I must see the king." This message, conveyed to the invalid, produced an invitation to walk upstairs. "What is it, sir?" asked the minister sharply as Dick came in. "I cannot possibly attend to any business whatever. I'm suffering the tortures of the damned with this infernal foot of mine. Now tell me, what is it?" Quickly Gordon related his discovery. "An astounding story," said the minister, and winced. "Where is the picture?" "In London, sir." "I can't come to London. It is humanly impossible. Can't you get somebody at the Home Office to certify this? When is this man to be hanged?" "Tomorrow morning, sir, at 8 o'clock. The Secretary of State considered, rubbing his chin irritably. "I should be no man if I refused to see this damned picture," he said, and Dick made allowance for his language as he rubbed his suffering limb. "But I can't go to town unless you get me an ambulance. You had better phone a garage in London to send a car down, or better still, get one from the local hospital." Everything seemed to be conspiring against him, for the local hospital's ambulance was under repair, but at last Dick put through a message to town, with the promise that an ambulance would be on its way in 10 minutes. An extraordinary story, a perfectly amazing story. And of course I can grant you a respite. Or, if I'm convinced of the truth of this astounding romance, we could get the king tonight. I could even promise you a reprieve. But my death will lie at your door if I catch cold. 2 hours passed before the ambulance came. The chauffeur had had to change his tires twice on the journey. Very gingerly, accompanied by furious imprecations from the cabinet minister, his stretcher was lifted into the ambulance. To Dick, the journey seemed interminable. He had telephoned through to Selensky, asking him to keep his office open until his arrival. It was 8 o'clock by the time the minister was assisted up to the theater and the picture was thrown upon the screen. Mr. Whitby watched the drama with the keenest interest, and when it was finished he drew a long breath. "That's all right so far as it goes," he said, "but how do I know this hasn't been play-acted in order to get this man a reprieve? And how am I to be sure that this wretched tramp is your man?" "I can assure you of that, sir," said Elk. "I got the photograph up from Gloucester this afternoon." He produced from his pocketbook 2 photographs, one in profile and one full face, and put them on the table before the minister. "Show the picture again," he ordered, and again they watched the presentation of the tragedy. "But how on earth did the man manage to take this picture?" "I've since discovered, sir, that he was in the neighborhood on that very day. He went out to get a photograph of a badger. I know this, sir, because Mr. Selensky has given me all the information in his power." Mr. Whitby looked up at Dick. "You're in the public prosecutor's department? I remember you very well, Captain Gordon. I must take your word. This is not a matter for respite, but for reprieve, until the whole of the circumstances are investigated." "Thank you, sir," said Dick, wiping his streaming forehead. "You better take me along to the Home Office," grumbled the great man. "Tomorrow I shall be cursing your name in memory, though I must confess that I'm feeling better for the drive. I want that picture." They had to wait until the picture was replaced in its box, and then Dick, Gordon, and Elk assisted the Secretary of State to the waiting ambulance. At 8:15, a reprieve, ready for the royal counter's signature, was in Dick's hand, and the miracle which Mr. Whitby had not dared expect had happened. He was able, with the aid of a stick, to hobble to a car. Before the great palace, streams of carriages and motor cars were passing. It was the night of the first ball of the season, and the hall of the palace was a brilliant sight. The glitter of women's jewels, the scarlet, blue, and green of diplomatic uniforms, the flash of innumerable orders, no less than the organization of this gorgeous gathering, interested Dick as he stood, a strangely contrasting figure, watching the pageant pass him. The minister had disappeared into an anteroom and presently came back and crooked his finger. Dick followed him down a red-carpeted passage past a white-haired footman in scarlet and gold, until they came to a door before which another footman stood. A whispered word, the footman knocked, and a voice bade them to enter. The servant opened the door and they went in. The man who was sitting at the table rose. He wore the scarlet uniform of a general. Across his breast was the blue ribbon of the garter. There was in his eyes a kindliness and humanity which Dick had not imagined he would find. "Will you be seated? Now, please tell me the story as quickly as you can, because I have an appointment elsewhere, and punctuality is the politeness of princes," he smiled. He listened attentively, stopping Gordon now and again to ask a question. When Dick had finished, he took up a pen and wrote a word in a bold, boyish hand, blotted it punctiliously, and handed it to the Secretary of State. "There is your reprieve. I am very glad," he said, and Dick, bowing over the extended hand, felt the music of triumph in his soul, forgot for the moment the terrible danger in which this boy had stood, and forgot, too, the most important factor of all, the frog, still vigilant, still vengeful, still powerful. When he got back to the Home Office and had taken farewell, with a very earnest expression of gratitude, of the irascible but kindly minister, Dick flew up the stairs to his own office and seized the telephone. "Put me through to Gloucester 8585 official," he said, and waited for the long-distance signal. It came after a few minutes. "Sorry, sir, no call through to Gloucester. Line out of order. Trunk wires cut." Dick put down the phone slowly. Then it was that he remembered that the frog still lived. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of The Fellowship of the Frog by Edgar Wallace. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 35. Getting Through. When Elk came up to the prosecutor's room, Dick was sitting at the table, writing telegrams. They were each addressed to the governor of Gloucester Prison and contained a brief intimation that a reprieve for James Carter was on its way. Each was marked via a different route. "What's the idea?" said Elk. "The phone to Gloucester is out of order," said Dick, and Elk bit his lip thoughtfully. "Is that so?" he drawled. "Then if the phone's out of order—" "I don't want to think that," said Dick. Elk took up the instrument. "Give me the Central Telegraph Office, miss," he said. "I want to speak to the chief clerk." "Yes, Inspector Elk, CID. After a pause, he announced himself again. "We're putting some wires through to Gloucester. I suppose the lines are all right?" His face did not move a muscle while he listened. Then, "I see," he said. "Any roundabout route we can get? Where's the nearest town open?" A wait. "Is that so? Thank you." He put down the instrument. "All wires to Gloucester are cut. The trunk wire has been cut in 3 places. The connection with Birmingham, which runs in an earthenware pipe underground, has been blown up, also in 3 places. Dick's eyes narrowed. "Try the radio company," he said. "They've got a station at Devizes, and another one somewhere near Cheltenham, and they could send on a message." Again Elk applied himself to the telephone. "Is that the radio station?" "Inspector Elk, Headquarters Police speaking. I want to get a message through to Gloucester Prison via... Eh? But I thought you'd overcome that difficulty. How long has it been jammed?" "Thank you," he said, and put down the telephone for the second time. "There's a jam," he said. "No messages are getting through. The radio people say that somebody in this country has got a secret apparatus which was used by the Germans during the war, and that when the jam is on, it is impossible to get anything through." Dick looked at his watch. It was now 9:30. "You can catch the 10:05 for Gloucester, Elk, but somehow I don't think it will get through." "As a telephone expert," said Elk, as he patiently applied himself to the instrument, "I have many of the qualities that make, so to speak, for greatness. Hello, get me Great Western, please. Great Western Station Master." "I have a perfect voice. a tremendous amount of patience, and a faith in my fellow men. And, hello? Is that you, Station Master? Inspector Elk. I told you that before. No, it was somebody else. Inspector Elk, CID. Is there any trouble in your road tonight? A longer pause this time. Glory be, said Elk unemotionally. Any chance of getting through? None whatever? What time will you have trains running? Thank you. He turned to Dick. 3 culverts and a bridge down at Swindon, blown at 7 o'clock, 2 men in custody, 1 man dead, shot by railguard. 2 culverts down at Reading, the metal's blown up at Slough. I won't trouble to call up the other roads because, well, the frog's thorough. Dick Gordon opened a cupboard and took out a leather coat and a soft leather helmet. In his drawer he found 2 ugly-looking Browning pistols and examined their magazines before he slipped them into his pocket. Then he selected half a dozen cigars and packed them carefully in the breast pocket of the coat. You're not going alone, Gordon? Asked Elk sternly. Dick nodded. I'm going alone, he said. If I don't get through, you follow. Send a police car after me and tell them to drive carefully. I don't think they'll stop me this side of Newbury, he said. I can make that before the light goes. Tell Miss Bennet that the reprieve is signed and that I'm on my way. Elk said nothing, but followed his chief into the street and stood by him with the policeman who had been left in charge of the car, while Dick made a careful scrutiny of the tires and petrol tank. So Dick Gordon took the Bath Road, and the party of gunmen that waited at the 2 aerodromes of London to shoot him down if he attempted to leave by the aerial route waited in vain. He avoided the direct road to Reading and was taking the longer way round. He came into Newbury at 11 o'clock and learnt of more dynamited culverts. The town was full of it. 2 laden trains were held up on the down line, and their passengers thronged the old-fashioned streets of the town. Outside the Checkers, he spoke to the local inspector of police. Beyond the outrages they had heard nothing, and apparently the road was in good order, for a car had come through from Swindon only 10 minutes before Dick arrived. You're safe as far as Swindon anyway, said the inspector. The countryside has been swarming with tramps lately, but my mounted patrols, that have just come in, have seen none on the roads. A thought struck Dick, and he drove the inspector round to the police station and went inside with him. I want an envelope and some official paper, he said, and sitting down at the desk he made a rough copy of the reprieve with its quaint terminology, sealed the envelope with wax, and put it into his pocket. Then he took the real reprieve, and taking off his shoe and sock, put it between his bare foot and his sock. Replacing his shoe, he jumped onto the car and started his cautious way towards Didcot. Both his glare lamps were on, and the road before him was as light as day. Nevertheless, he went at half speed, one of his Brownings on the cushion beside him. Against the afterglow of the sunset, a faint pale light which is the glory of late summer, he saw 3 inverted V's and knew that they were the ends of a building, possibly an aerodrome. And then he remembered that Elk had told him of the chemical factory. Probably this was the place, and he drove with greater caution. He had turned the bend, when ahead of him he saw 3 red lights stretched across the road, and in the light of the headlamp stood a policeman. He slowed the machine and stopped within a few yards of the officer. You can't go this way, sir. The road's up. How long has it been up? Asked Dick. It's been blown up, sir. About 20 minutes ago, was the reply. There's a side road a mile back, which will bring you to the other side of the railway lines. You can back in here. He indicated a gateway evidently leading to the factory. Dick pulled back his lever to the reverse and sent the roll spinning backward into the opening. His hand was reaching to change the direction when the policeman who had walked to the side of the car struck at him. Gordon's head was bent. He was incapable of resistance. Only the helmet he wore saved him from death. He saw nothing, only suddenly the world went black. Scarcely had the blow been struck when 6 men came from the shadows. Somebody jumped into the driver's seat, and flinging out the limp figure of its owner, brought the car still further backward and switched off the lights. Another of the party removed the red lamps. The policeman bent over the prostrate figure of Dick Gordon. I thought I'd settled him, he said, disappointed. Well, settle him now, said somebody in the darkness, but evidently the assailant changed his mind. Hagen will want him, he said. Lift him up. They carried the inanimate figure over the rough ground, through a sliding door, into a big, ill-lit factory hall, bare of machinery. At the far end was a brick partition forming an office, and into this he was carried and flung on the floor. "Here's your man, Hagen," growled the policeman. "I think he's through." Hagen got up from his table and walked across to where Dick Gordon lay. "I don't think there's much wrong with him," he said. "You couldn't kill a man through that helmet anyway. Take it off." They took the leather helmet from the head of the unconscious man, and Hagen made a brief inspection. "No, he's all right," he said. "Throw some water over him. Wait, you'd better search him first. Those cigars," he said, pointing to the brown cylinders that protruded from his breast pocket, "I want." The first thing found was the blue envelope, and this Hagen tore open and read. "It seems all right," he said, and locked it away in the roll-top desk at which he was sitting when Dick had been brought in. "Now give him the water." Dick came to his senses with a throbbing head and a feeling of resentment against the consciousness which was being forced upon him. He sat up, rubbing his face like a man roused from a heavy sleep, screwed up his eyes in the face of the bright light, and unsteadily stumbled to his feet, looking around from one to the other of the grinning faces. "Oh," he said at last, "I seem to have struck it. Who hit me?" "We'll give you his card presently," sneered Hagen. "Where are you off to at this time of night?" "I'm going to Gloucester," said Dick. "Like hell you are," scoffed Hagen. "Put him upstairs, boys." Leading up from the office was a flight of unpainted pine stairs, and up this he was partly pushed and partly dragged. The room above had been used in wartime as an additional supervisor's office. It had a large window, commanding a view of the whole of the floor space. The window was now thick with grime, and the floor littered with rubbish which the present occupants had not thought it worth while to move. "Search him again, and make sure he hasn't any gun on him. And take away his boots," said Hagen. A small carbon filament lamp cast a sickly yellow light upon the sinister group that surrounded Dick Gordon. He had time to take his bearings. The window he had seen, and escape that way was impossible. The ceiling was covered with matchboards that had once been varnished. There was no other way out, save down the steps. "You got to stay here for a day or two, Gordon, but perhaps if the government will give us Balder, you'll get away with your life. If they don't, then it'll be a case of good night, nurse." End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of The Fellowship of the Frog by Edgar Wallace. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 36. The Power Cable. Dick Gordon knew that any discussion with his captors was a waste of breath, and that repartee was profitless. His head was aching, but no sooner was he left alone than he gave himself a treatment which an osteopath had taught him. He put his chin on his breast and his two open hands behind his neck, the fingertips pressing hard. Then he slowly raised his head. It was an agony to do so, bringing his fingers down over the jugular. 3 times repeated, his head was comparatively clear. The door was of thin wood and could easily be forced, but the room below was filled with men. Presently the light below went out, and the place was in darkness. He guessed that it was because Hagen did not wish the light to be seen from the road, though it was unlikely that there would come any inquiries. He had taken effective steps to deal with the police car which he knew would follow. They had not taken his matches away, and Dick struck one and looked round. Standing before a fireplace filled with an indescribable litter of half-burnt papers and dust was a steel plate, with holes for rivets, evidently part of a tank which had not been assembled. There was a heavy switch on the wall, and Dick turned it, hoping that it controlled the light. But apparently that was on the same circuit as the light below. He struck another match and followed the casing of the switch. By and by he saw a thick black cable running in the angle of the wall and the ceiling. It terminated abruptly on the right of the fireplace, and from the marks on the floor, Dick guessed that at some time or other there had been an experimental welding plant housed there. He turned the switch again and sat down to consider what would be the best thing to do. He could hear the murmur of voices below, and lying on the floor, put his ear to the trap, which he cleared with a piece of wire he found in the fireplace. Hagen seemed to do most of the talking. "If we blow up the road between here and Newbury, they'll smell a rat," he said. It's a stupid idea you put forward, Hagen. What are you going to do with the chap upstairs? I don't know. I'm waiting to hear from Frog. Perhaps the Frog will want him killed. He'd be a good man to hold for Balder, though, if Frog thought it was worthwhile. Towards 5 o'clock, Hagen, who had been out of the office, came back. Frog says he's got to die, he said in a low voice. 2 people sat in Dick Gordon's study. The hour was 4 o'clock in the morning. Elk had gone for the 20th time to headquarters, and for the 20th time was on his way back. Ella Bennett had tried desperately hard to carry out Dick's instructions and turned page after page determinedly, but had read and yet had seen nothing. With a deep sigh, she put down the book and clasped her hands, her eyes fixed upon the clock. "Do you think he will get to Gloucester?" she asked. "I certainly do," said Broad confidently. "That young man will get anywhere. He is the right kind and the right type, and nothing is going to hold him." She picked up the book, but did not look at its printed page. "What happened to the police cars? Mr. Elk was telling me a lot about them last night," she said. "I haven't heard since." Joshua Broad licked his dry lips. "Oh, they got through all right," he said vaguely. He did not tell her that 2 police cars had been ditched between Newbury and Reading, the cars smashed and 3 men injured by a mine which had been sprung under them. Nor did he give her the news that had arrived by motorcyclist from Swindon that Dick's car had not been seen. "They are dreadful people, dreadful," she shivered. "How did they come into existence, Mr. Broad?" Broad was smoking, at her request, a long, thin cigar, and he puffed for a long time before he spoke. "I guess I'm the father of the Frogs," he said to her amazement. "You?" He nodded. "I didn't know I was producing this outfit, but there it is." How, he did not seem disposed to explain at that moment. Soon he heard the whir of the bell, and thinking that Elk had perhaps forgotten the key, he rose, and going along the passage opened the door. It was not Elk. "Forgive me for calling. Is that Mr. Broad?" The visitor peered forward in the darkness. "I'm Broad, all right. You're Mr. Johnson, aren't you? Come right in, Mr. Johnson." He closed the door behind him and turned on the light. The stout man was in a state of pitiable agitation. "I was up late last night," he said, "and my servant brought me an early copy of the Post-Herald." "So you know, eh?" "It's terrible, terrible. I can't believe it." He took a crumpled paper from his pocket and looked at the stop-press space as though to reassure himself. "I didn't know it was in the paper." Johnson handed the newspaper to the American. "Yes, they've got it. I suppose old man Whitby must have given away the story." "I think it came from the picture man, Selensky. Is it true that Ray is under sentence of death?" Broad nodded. "How dreadful," said Johnson in a hushed voice. "Thank God they found it out in time. Mr. Broad," he said earnestly, "I hope you will tell Ella Bennett that she can rely on me for every penny I possess to establish her brother's innocence. I suppose there will be a respite and a new trial? If there is, the very best lawyers must be employed." "She's here. Won't you come in and see her?" "Here?" Johnson's jaw dropped. "I had no idea," he stammered. "Come in." Broad returned to the girl. "Here is a friend of yours who has turned up, Mr. Johnson." The philosopher crossed the room with quick, nervous strides and held out both his hands to the girl. "I'm so sorry, Miss Bennett," he said. "So very, very sorry. It must be dreadful for you, dreadful. Can I do anything?" She shook her head, tears of gratitude in her eyes. "It is very sweet of you, Mr. Johnson. You've done so much for Ray, and Inspector Elk was telling me that you had offered him a position in your office." Johnson shook his head. "It is nothing. I'm very fond of Ray, and he really has splendid capabilities. Once we get him out of this mess, I'll put him on his feet again. Your father doesn't know? Thank God for that." "I wish this news hadn't got into the paper," she said, when he told her how he had learnt of the happening. "Selensky, of course," said Broad. "A motion picture publicity man would use his own funeral to get a free par." "How are you feeling in your new position, Johnson?" he asked to distract the girl's mind from the tragic thoughts which were oppressing her. Johnson smiled. "I'm bewildered. I can't understand why poor Mr. Maitland did this. But I had my first frog warning today, I feel almost important, he said. From a worn pocket case he extracted a sheet of paper. It contained only 3 words. "You are next," and bore the familiar sign manual of the frog. I don't know what harm I have done to these people, but I presume that it is something fairly bad, for within 10 minutes of getting this note, the porter brought me my afternoon tea. I took 1 sip and it tasted so bitter that I washed my mouth out with a disinfectant. When was this? Yesterday, said Johnson. This morning I had the analysis. I had the tea bottled and sent off at once to an analytical chemist. It contained enough hydrocyanic acid to kill 100 people. The chemist cannot understand how I could have taken the sip I did without very serious consequences. I'm going to put the matter in the hands of the police today. The front door opened and Elk came in. What is the news? Asked the girl eagerly, rising to meet him. Fine, said Elk. You needn't worry at all, Miss Bennet. That Gordon man can certainly move. I guess he's in Gloucester by now, sleeping in the best bed in the city. But do you know he's in Gloucester? She asked stubbornly. I've had no exact news, but I can tell you this, that we've had no bad news, said Elk. And when there's no news, you can bet that things are going according to schedule. How did you hear about it, Johnson? The new millionaire explained. I ought to have pulled in Selensky and his operator, said Elk thoughtfully. These motion picture men lack reticence. And how does it feel to be rich, Johnson? He asked. Mr. Johnson doesn't think it feels too good, said Broad. He has attracted the attention of Old Man Frog. Elk examined the warning carefully. When did this come? I found it on my desk yesterday morning, said Johnson, and told him of the tea incident. Do you think, Mr. Elk, you will ever put your hand on the frog? I'm as certain as that I'm standing here that Frog will go the way— Elk checked himself, and fortunately the girl was not listening. It was getting light when Johnson left, and Elk walked with him to the door and watched him passing down the deserted street. There's a lot about that boy I like, he said, and he's certainly fortunate. Why the old man didn't leave his money to that baby of his. Did you ever find the baby? Interrupted Broad. No, sir, there was no sign of that innocent child in the house. That's another frog mystery to be cleared up. Johnson had reached the corner, and they saw him crossing the road when a man came out of the shadow to meet him. There was a brief parley, and then Elk saw the flash of a pistol and heard a shot. Johnson staggered back, and his opponent, turning, fled. In a second, Elk was flying along the street. Apparently the philosopher was not hurt, though he seemed shaken. The inspector ran round the corner, but the assassin had disappeared. He returned to the philosopher to find him sitting on the edge of the pavement, and at first he thought he had been wounded. No, I think I just had a shock, gasped Johnson. I was quite unprepared for that method of attack. What happened? Asked Elk. I can hardly realize, said the other, who appeared dazed. I was crossing the road when a man came up and asked me if my name was Johnson. Then, before I knew what had happened, he had fired. His coat was singed by the flame of the shot, but the bullet must have gone wide. Later in the day, Elk found it embedded in the brickwork of a house. No, I won't come back, said Johnson. I don't suppose they'll repeat the attempt. By this time, one of the 2 detectives who had been guarding Harley Terrace had come up, and under his escort Johnson was sent home. They're certainly the busiest little fellows, said Elk, shaking his head. You'd think they'd be satisfied with the work they were doing at Gloucester, without running sidelines. Joshua Broad was silent until they were going up the steps of the house. When you know as much about the frog as I know, you'll be surprised at nothing, he said, and did not add to this cryptic remark. 6 o'clock came, and there was no further news from the west. 7 o'clock, and the girl's condition became pitiable. She had borne herself throughout the night with a courage that excited the admiration of the men, but now, as the hour was drawing close, she seemed on the verge of collapse. At 7:30 the telephone bell rang, and Elk answered. It was the chief of police at Newbury speaking. Captain Gordon left Didcot an hour ago, was the message. Didcot, gasped Elk in consternation. He looked at the clock. An hour ago. And he had to make Gloucester in 60 minutes. The girl, who had been in the dining room trying to take coffee which Gordon's servant had prepared, came into the study, and Elk dared not continue the conversation. All right, he said loudly, and smashed down the receiver. What is the news, Mr. Elk? The girl's voice was a wail. "The news," said Elk, twisting his face into a smile, "is fine." "What do they say?" she persisted. "Oh, them?" said Elk, looking at the telephone. "That was a friend of mine, asking me if I'd dine with him tonight." She went back to the dining room, only half satisfied, and Elk called the American to him. "Go and get a doctor," he said in a low voice, "and tell him to bring something that'll put this young lady to sleep for 12 hours. "Why?" asked Broad. "Is the news bad?" Elk nodded. "There isn't a chance of saving this boy. Not the ghost of a chance," he said. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of The Fellowship of the Frog by Edgar Wallace. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 37. The Getaway. Dick, with his ear to the floor, heard the words, "Frog says he's got to die," and his cracked lips parted in a grin. "Have you heard him moving about?" asked Hagen. "No, he's asleep, I expect," said another voice. "We shall have to wait for light. We can't do it in the dark. We shall be killing one another." This view commended itself to most of the men present. Dick counted 6 voices. He struck a match for another survey, and again his eye fell upon the cable. And then an inspiration came to him. Moving stealthily across the floor, he reached up and, gripping the cable, pulled on it steadily. Under his weight, the supporting insulator broke loose. By great good luck, it fell upon the heap of rubbish in the fireplace and made no sound. For the next half hour he worked feverishly, unwrapping the rubber insulation from the wires of the cable, pulling the copper strands free. His hands were bleeding, his nails broken, but after half an hour's hard work, he had the end of the cable frayed. The door opened outward, he remembered with satisfaction, and lifting the steel plate, he laid it tight against the door so that whoever entered must step on it. Then he began to fasten the frayed copper wires of the cable to the rivet holes, and he had hardly finished his work before he heard a stealthy sound on the stairs. Day had come now, and light was streaming through the glass roof of the factory. He heard a faint whisper, and even as faint a click, as the bolts of the door were pulled, and creeping to the switch, he turned it down. The door was jerked open, and a man stepped upon the plate. Before his scream could warn him who followed, the second of the party had been flung senseless to the floor. "What the devil's wrong?" It was Hagen's voice. He came running up the stairs, put one foot on the electric plate, and stood for the space of a second motionless. Then, with a gasping sob, he fell backward, and Dick heard the crash as he struck the stairs. He did not wait any longer. Jumping over the plate, he leapt down the stairs, treading underfoot the senseless figure of Hagen. The little office was empty. On the table lay one of his pistols. He gripped it and fled along the bare factory hall, through a door into the open. He heard a shout, and looking round, saw 2 of the party coming at him, and raising his pistol, he pressed the trigger. There was a click. Hagen had emptied the magazine. A Browning is an excellent weapon, even if it is not loaded, and Dick Gordon brought the barrel down with smashing force upon the head of the man who tried to grapple with him. Then he turned and ran. He had made a mistake when he thought that there were only 6 men in the building. There must have been 20, and most of them were in full cry. He tried to reach the road, and was separated only by a line of bushes. But here he blundered. The bushes concealed a barbed wire fence, and he had to run along uneven ground, and in his stocking feet the effort was painful. His slow progress enabled his pursuers to get ahead. Doubling back, Dick flew for the second of the 3 buildings, and as he ran, he took out the magazine of his pistol. As he feared, it was empty. Now they were on him. He could hear the leading man's breath, and he himself was nearly spent. And then before him he saw a round fire alarm fixed to the wall, and in a flash the memory of an almost forgotten conversation came back to him. With his bare hands he smashed the glass and tugged at the alarm, and at that minute they were on him. He fought desperately, but against their numbers resistance was almost useless. He must gain time. "Get up, you fellows," he shouted. "Hagen's dead." It was an unfortunate statement, for Hagen came out of the next building at that moment, very shaken but very alive. He was livid with rage, and babbled in some language which Dick did not know, but which he guessed was Swedish. I'll fix you for that. You shall try electric shock yourself, you dog. He drove his fist at the prisoner's face, but Dick twisted his head and the blow struck the brickwork of the building against which he stood. With a scream, the man leapt at him, clawing and tearing with open hands, and this was Dick's salvation. For the men who were gripping his arms released their hold, that their chief might have freer play. Dick struck out, hitting scientifically for the body, and with a yell, Hagen collapsed. Before they could stop him, Gordon was away like the wind, this time making for the gate. He had reached it when the hand of the nearest man fell on him. He flung him aside and staggered into the roadway, and then, from down the straight road, came the clang of bells, a glitter of brass and a touch of crimson. A motor fire engine was coming at full speed. For a moment the men grouped about the gate stared at this intervention. Then, without taking any further notice of their quarry, they turned and ran. A word to the fire chief explained the situation. Another engine was coming at breakneck speed, and firemen were men for whom frogs had no terror. Whilst Hagen was being carried to one of the waiting wagons, Dick looked at his watch. It was 6 o'clock. He went in search of his car, fearing the worst. Hagen, however, had made no attempt to put the car out of gear. Probably he had some plan for using it himself. 3 minutes later, Dick, disheveled, grimy, bearing the marks of Hagen's talons upon his face, swung out into the road and set the bonnet of the car for Gloucester. He could not have gone faster even had he known that his watch had stopped. Through Swindon at breakneck speed, and he was on the Gloucester road. He looked at his watch again. The hand still pointed to 6, and he gave a gasp. He was going all out now, but the road was bad, full of windings, and once he was nearly thrown out of the car when he struck a ridge on the road. The tire burst, and he almost swerved into the hedge, but he got her nose straight again and continued on a flat tire. It brought his speed down appreciably, and he grew hot and cold as mile after mile of the road flashed past without a sign of the town. And then, with Gloucester Cathedral showing its spires above the hill, a second tire exploded. He could not stop. He must go on, if he had to run into Gloucester on the rims. And now the pace was painfully slow in comparison with that frantic rush which had carried him through Berkshire and Wiltshire to the edge of Somerset. He was entering the straggling suburbs of the town. The roads were terrible. He was held up by a streetcar, but, disregarding a policeman's warning, flew past almost under the wheels of a great traction engine. And now he saw the time, 2 minutes to 8, and the jail was half a mile farther on. He set his teeth and prayed. As he turned into the main street, with the jail gates before him, the clocks of the cathedral struck 8, and to Dick Gordon they were the notes of doom. They would delay the carrying out of the death penalty for nothing short of the reprieve he carried. Punctually to the second, Ray Bennett would die. The agony of that moment was a memory that turned him gray. He brought the bumping car to a halt before the prison gates and staggered to the bell. Twice he pulled, but the gates remained closed. Dick pulled off his sock and found the sodden reprieve streaky with blood, for his feet were bleeding. Again he rang with the fury of despair. Then a little wicket opened, and the dark face of a warder appeared. "You're not allowed in," he said curtly. "You know what is happening here." "Home Office," said Dick thickly. "Home Office messenger. I have a reprieve." The wicket closed, and after an eternity, the lock turned and the heavy door opened. "I'm Captain Gordon," gasped Dick, "from the public prosecutor's office, and I carry a reprieve for James Carter." The warder shook his head. "The execution took place 5 minutes ago, sir," he said. "But the cathedral clock," gasped Dick. "The cathedral clock is 4 minutes slow," said the warder. "I am afraid Carter is dead." End of chapter 37. Chapter 38 of The Fellowship of the Frog by Edgar Wallace. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 38. The Mystery Man. Ray Bennett woke from a refreshing sleep and sat up in bed. One of the warders, who had watched him all night, got up and came over. "Do you want your clothes, Carter?" he said. "The governor thought you wouldn't care to wear those old things of yours." "And he was right," said the grateful Ray. "This looks like a good suit," he said as he pulled on the trousers. The warder coughed. "Yes, it's a good suit," he agreed. He did not say more, but something in his demeanor betrayed the truth. These were the clothes in which some men had been hanged, and yet Ray's hands did not shake as he fixed the web braces which held them. Poor clothes to do duty on two such dismal occasions. He hoped they would be spared the indignity of a third experience. They brought him his breakfast at 6 o'clock. Yet once more his eyes strayed toward the writing pad, and then with breakfast over came the chaplain, a quiet man in minister's garb, strength in every line of his mobile face. They talked a while, and then the warder suggested that Ray should go to take exercise in the paved yard outside. He was glad of the privilege. He wanted once more to look upon the blue sky, to draw into his lungs the balm of God's air. Yet he knew that it was not a disinterested kindness, and well guessed why this privilege had been afforded to him as he walked slowly round the exercise yard, arm in arm with the clergyman. He knew now what lay behind the third door. They were going to try the trap in the death house, and they wished to spare his feelings. In half an hour he was back in the cell. "Do you want to make any confession, Carter? Is that your name?" "No, it is not my name, sir," said Ray quietly, "but that doesn't matter." "Did you kill this man?" "I don't know," said Ray. "I wanted to kill him, and therefore it is likely that I did." At 10 minutes to 8 came the governor to shake hands, and with him the sheriff. The clock in the prison hall moved slowly and inexorably forward. Through the open door of the cell Ray could see it, and knowing this, the governor closed the door, for it was 1 minute to 8, and it would soon open again. Ray saw the door move. For a second his self-possession deserted him, and he turned his back to the man who came with a quick step and gripping his hand strapped them. "God forgive me! God forgive me!" murmured somebody behind him, and at the sound of that voice Ray spun round and faced the executioner. The hangman was John Bennett! Father and son, executioner and convicted murderer soon to be launched to death, they faced one another, and then, in a voice that was almost inaudible, John Bennett breathed the word. "Ray." Ray nodded. It was strange that, in that moment, his mind was going back over the mysterious errands of his father, his hatred of the job into which circumstances had forced him. "Ray," breathed the man again. "You know this man?" It was the governor, and his voice was shaking with emotion. John Bennett turned. "He is my son," he said, and with a quick pull loosed the strap. "You must go on with this, Bennett." The governor's voice was stern and terrible. "Go on with it," repeated John Bennett mechanically. "Go on with this? Kill my own son? Are you mad? Do you think I am mad?" He took the boy in his arms, his cheek against the hairy face. "My boy, oh my boy," he said, and smoothed his hair as he had done in the days when Ray was a child. Then, recovering himself instantly, he thrust the boy through the open door into the death chamber, followed him and slammed the door, bolting it. There was no other doorway except that to which he had the key, and this he thrust into the lock that it might not be opened from the other side. Ray looked at the bare chamber, the dangling yellow rope, the marks of the trap, and fell back against the wall, his eyes shut, shivering. Then, standing in the middle of the trap, John Bennett hacked the rope until it was severed, hacked it in pieces as it lay on the floor. Then, crack! Crash! The two traps dropped, and into the yawning gap he flung the cut rope. "Father!" Ray was staring at him, oblivious to the thunderous blows which were being rained on the door. The old man came towards him, took the boy's face between his hands, and kissed him. "Will you forgive me, Ray?" he asked brokenly. "I had to do this. I was forced to do it. I starved before I did it. I came once, out of curiosity, to help the executioner, a broken-down doctor who had taken on the work. And he was ill. I hanged the murderer. I had just come from medical school. It didn't seem so dreadful to me then. I tried to find some other way of making money, and lived in dread all my life that somebody would point his finger at me and say, 'There goes Ben, the executioner.'" "Ben, the executioner," said Ray wonderingly. "Are you Ben?" The old man nodded. "Ben, come out. I give you my word of honor that I will postpone the execution until tomorrow. You can't stay there." John Bennet looked round at the grating, then up to the cut rope. The execution could not proceed. Such was the routine of death that the rope must be expressly issued from the headquarter jail. No other rope would serve. All the paraphernalia of execution, down to the piece of chalk that marks a T on the trap where a man must put his feet, must be punctiliously forwarded from prison headquarters and as punctiliously returned. John shot back the bolts, opened the door, and stepped out. The faces of the men in the condemned cell were ghastly. The governor's was white and drawn, the prison doctor seemed to have shrunk, and the sheriff sat on the bed, his face hidden in his hands. "I will telegraph to London and tell them the circumstances," said the governor. "I am not condemning you for what you're doing, Ben. It would be monstrous to expect you to have done this thing." A warder came along the corridor and through the door of the cell, and behind him, entering the prison by virtue of his authority, a disheveled, dust-stained, limping figure, his face scratched, streaks of blood on his face, his eyes red with weariness. For a second John Bennet did not recognize him, and then, "A reprieve by the king's own hand," said Dick Gordon unsteadily, and handed the stained envelope to the governor. End of chapter 38. Chapter 39 of The Fellowship of the Frog by Edgar Wallace. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 39. The Awakening. Throughout the night, Ella Bennet lay half waking, half sleeping. She remembered the doctor coming. She remembered Elk's urgent request that she should drink the draught he had prepared. And though she had suspected its nature and at first had fought against drinking that milky white potion, she had at last succumbed, and had laid down on the sofa, determined that she would not sleep until she knew the worst or the best. She was exhausted with the mental fight she had put up to preserve her sanity, and then she had dozed. She was dimly conscious, as she came back to understanding, that she was lying on a bed, and that somebody had taken off her shoes and loosened her hair. With a tremendous effort, she opened her eyes and saw a woman sitting by a window reading. The room was intensely masculine. It smelt faintly of smoke. "Dick's bed," she muttered, and the woman put down her book and got up. Ella looked at her, puzzled. Why did she wear those white bands about her hair, and that butcher blue wrapper and the white cuffs? She was a nurse, of course. Satisfied with having solved that problem, Ella closed her eyes and went back again into the land of dreams. She woke again. The woman was still there, but this time the girl's mind was in order. "What time is it?" she asked. The nurse came over with a glass of water, and Ella drank greedily. "It is 7 o'clock, she said. 7! The girl shivered, and then with a cry tried to rise. "It is evening," she gasped. "Oh, what happened?" "Your father is downstairs, miss," said the nurse. "I'll call him." "Father? Here?" She frowned. "Is there any other news?" "Mr. Gordon is downstairs too, miss, and Mr. Johnson." The woman was faithfully carrying out the instructions which had been given to her. "Nobody else?" asked Ella in a whisper. "No, miss. The other gentleman is coming tomorrow or the next day. Your brother, I mean." With a sob, the girl buried her face in the pillow. "You are not telling the truth." "Oh, yes, I am," said the woman, and there was something in her laugh which made Ella look up. The nurse went out of the room and was gone a little while. Presently the door opened, and John Bennet came in. Instantly she was in his arms, sobbing her joy. It is true, Daddy?" "Yes, my love, it is true," said Bennet. "Ray will be here tomorrow. There are some formalities to be gone through. They can't secure a release immediately, as they do in storybooks. We are discussing his future." "Oh, my girl, my poor girl." "When did you know, Daddy?" "I knew this morning," said her father quietly. Were you dreadfully hurt?" she asked. He nodded. "Johnson wants to give Ray the management of Maitland's Consolidated," he said. "It would be a splendid thing for Ray. Ella, our boy has changed." "Have you seen him?" she asked in surprise. "Yes, I saw him this morning." She thought it was natural that her father should have seen him, and did not question him as to how he managed to get behind the jealously guarded doors of the prison. "I don't think Ray will accept Johnson's offer," he said. "If I know him as he is now, I am sure he will not accept. He will not take any ready-made position. He wants to work for himself. He is coming back to us, Ella." She wanted to ask him something, but feared to hurt him. "Daddy, when Ray comes back," she said after a long silence, "will it be possible for you to leave this work you hate so much?" "I have left it, dear," he replied quietly. "Never again, never again, never again, thank God." She did not see his face, but she felt the tremor that passed through the frame of the man who held her. Downstairs, the study was blue with smoke. Dick Gordon, conspicuously bandaged about the head, something of his good looks spoiled by 3 latitudinal scratches which ran down his face, sat in his dressing gown and slippers, a big pipe clenched between his teeth, the picture of battered contentment. "Very good of you, Johnson," he said. "I wonder whether Bennett will take your offer. Honestly, do you think he's competent to act as the manager of this enormous business?" Johnson looked dubious. "He was a clerk at Maitland's. You can have no knowledge of his administrative qualities. Aren't you being just a little too generous?" "I don't know. Perhaps I am," said Johnson quietly. "I naturally want to help. There may be other positions less important, and perhaps, as you say, Ray might not care to take any quite as responsible." "I'm sure he won't," said Dick decidedly. "It seems to me," said Elk, "that the biggest job of all is to get young Bennett out of the clutches of the frogs. Once a frog, always a frog. And this old man is not going to sit down and take his beating like a little gentleman. We had a proof of that yesterday morning. They shot at Johnson in this very street." Dick took out his pipe, sent a cloud of blue smoke toward the haze that lay on the room. "The frog is finished," he said. "The only question now is, what is the best and most effective way to make an end? Balder is caught, Hagen is in jail, Lou Brady, who was one of their most helpful agents, though he did not hold any executive position, Lou is dead, Lola is through." It was the American who spoke. "She left this morning for the United States. I took the liberty of facilitating her passage. There remains Frog himself and the organization which Frog controls. Catch him, and you've finished with the gang." John Bennett came back at that moment, and the conversation took another turn. Soon after, Joshua Broad and Johnson went away together. "You have not told Ella anything, Mr. Bennett?" "About myself? No. Is it necessary?" "I hope you will not think so," said Dick quietly. "Let that remain your own secret and Ray's secret. It has been known to me for a very long time. The day Elk told me that he had seen you coming from King's Cross Station and that a burglary had been committed, I saw in the newspapers that a man had been executed in York Prison. And then I took the trouble to look up the files of the newspapers, and I found that your absences had certainly coincided with burglaries. And there are so many burglaries in England in the course of a year that it would have been remarkable if they had not coincided. There were also other coincidences. On the day the murder was committed at Ibley Copse, you were in Gloucester, and on that day Walsden, the Hereford murderer, was executed." John Bennett hung his head. "You knew, and yet—" he hesitated. Dick nodded. "I knew none of the circumstances which drove you to this dreadful business, Mr. Bennett," he said gently. "To me you were an officer of the law, no more, no less terrible than I, who have helped send many men to the scaffold, no more unclean than the judge who sentences them and signs the warrant of their death. We are instruments of order." Ella and her father stayed that night at Harley Terrace, and in the morning drove down to Paddington Station to meet the boy. Neither Dick nor Elk accompanied them. "There are 2 things which strike me as remarkable," said Elk. "One is that neither you nor I recognize Bennett." "Why should we?" asked Dick. "Neither you nor I attend executions, and the identity of the hangman has always been more or less unknown except to a very few people. If he cares to advertise himself, he is known. Bennett shrank from publicity, avoided even the stations of the towns where the executions took place, and usually alighted at some wayside village and tramped into the town on foot. The chief warder at Gloucester told me that he never arrived at the jail until midnight before an execution. Nobody saw him come or go." "Old man Maitland must have recognized him." "He did," nodded Dick. "At some period Maitland was in jail, and it is possible for prisoners, especially privileged prisoners, to catch a glimpse of the hangman. By privileged prisoners, I mean men who, by reason of their good conduct, were allowed to move about the jail freely. Maitland told Miss Bennet that he had been in quod, and I am certain that that is the true explanation. All Bennet's official letters came to him at Dorking, where he rented a room for years. His mysterious journeys to town were not mysterious to the people of Dorking, who did not know him by sight or name. To Elk's surprise, when he came back to Harley Terrace, Dick was not there. His servant said that his master had had a short sleep, and dressed and gone out, and had left no message as to where he was going. Dick did not, as a rule, go out on these solitary expeditions, and Elk's first thought was that he had gone to Horsham. He ate his dinner, and thought longingly of his comfortable bed. He did not wish to retire for the night until he had seen his chief. He made himself comfortable in the study, and was fast asleep, when somebody shook him gently by the shoulder. He looked up and saw Dick. "Hello," he said sleepily. "Are you staying up all night?" "I've got the car at the door," said Dick. "Get your top coat. We're going to Horsham." Elk yawned at the clock. "She'll be thinking of bed," he protested. "I hope so," said Dick, "but I have my fears. Frog was seen on the Horsham Road at 9 o'clock tonight." "How do you know?" asked Elk, now wide awake. "I've been shadowing him all evening," said Dick, "but he slipped me." "You've been watching the Frog?" repeated Elk slowly. "Do you know him?" "I've known him for the greater part of a month," said Dick Gordon. "Get your gun." End of chapter 39. Chapter 40 of The Fellowship of the Frog by Edgar Wallace. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 40. Frog. There is a happiness which has no parallel in life, the happiness which comes when a dear one is restored. Ray Bennett sat by his father's chair and was content to absorb the love and tenderness which made the room radiant. It seemed like a dream to be back in this cozy sitting room with its cretons, its faint odor of lavender, the wide chimney place, the leaded windows, and Ella, most glorious vision of all. The rainstorm that lashed the window panes gave the comfort and peace of his home a new and a more beautiful value. From time to time he fingered his shaven face absently. It was the only sure evidence to him that he was awake, and that this experience belonged to the world of reality. "Pull up your chair, boys," said John Bennett, as Ella carried in a steaming teapot and put it on the table. Ray rose obediently and placed the big Windsor chair where it had always been when he lived at home, on his father's right hand. John Bennett sat at the table, his head bent forward. It was the old grace that his father had said for years and years, and which secretly amused him in other days, but which was now invested with a beautiful significance that made him choke. "For all the blessings we have received this day, may the Lord make us truly thankful." It was a wonderful meal, more wonderful than any he had eaten at Heron's or at those expensive restaurants which he had favored. Home-cured tongue, homemade bread, and a great jar of homemade preserves, tea that was fragrant with the bouquet of the East. He laid down his knife and fork and leant back with a happy smile. "Home," he said simply, and his father gripped his hand under cover of the tablecloth, gripped and held it so tightly that the boy winced. "Ray, they want you to take over the management of Maitland's. Johnson does. What do you think of that, son?" Ray shook his head. "I am no more fit to manage Maitland's than I am to be president of the Bank of England," he said with a little laugh. "No, Dad, my views are less exalted than they were. I think I might earn a respectable living hoeing potatoes, and I should be happy to do so." The older man was looking thoughtfully at the table. I shall want an assistant if these pictures of mine are the success that Selensky says they will be. Perhaps you can hoe potatoes between whiles, when Ella is married." The girl went red. "Is Ella going to be married? Are you, Ella?" Ray jumped up and, going to the girl, kissed her. "Ella, it won't make a difference, will it? About me, I mean?" "I don't think so, dear. I've promised." "What's the matter?" asked John Bennett, as he saw the cloud that came to the girl's face. "I was thinking of something unpleasant, Daddy," she said, and for the first time told of the hideous visitation. The frog wanted to marry you? Said Ray with a frown. It is incredible. Did you see his face? She shook her head. He was masked, she said. Don't let us talk about it. She got up quickly and began to clear away the meal, and for the first time for many years Ray helped her. A terrible night, she said, coming back from the kitchen. The wind burst open the window and blew out the lamp, and the rain is coming down in torrents. All nights are good nights to me, said Ray, and in his chuckle she detected a little sob. No word had been spoken since they met of his terrible ordeal. It was tacitly agreed that that nightmare should remain in the region of bad dreams, and only now and again did he betray the horror of those 3 weeks of waiting. Bolt the back door, darling, said John Bennet, looking up as she went out. The 2 men sat smoking, each busy with his own thoughts. Then Ray spoke of Lola. I do not think she was bad, father, he said. She could not have known what was going to happen. The thing was so diabolically planned that even to the very last, until I learned from Gordon the true story, I was under the impression that I had killed Brady. This man must have the brain of a general. Bennet nodded. I always used to think, Ray went on, that Maitland had something to do with the frogs. I suppose he had, really. I first guessed that much after he turned up at Heron's Club. What is the matter? Ella, called the old man. There was no answer from the kitchen. I don't want her to stay out there washing up. Ray boy, call her in. Ray got up and opened the door of the kitchen. It was in darkness. Bring the lamp, father, he called, and John Bennet came hurrying after him. The door of the kitchen was closed but not bolted. Something white lay on the floor, and Ray stooped to pick it up. It was a torn portion of the apron which Ella had been wearing. The 2 men looked at one another, and Ray, running up to his room, came down with a storm lantern which he lit. She may be in the garden, he said in a strained voice, and throwing open the door went out into the storm. The rain beat down unmercifully. The men were wet through before they had gone a dozen yards. Ray held the light down to the ground. There were tracks of many feet in the soft mud, and presently he found one of Ella's. The tracks disappeared onto the edge of the lawn, but they were making straight for the side gate which opened into a narrow lane. This passageway connected the road with a meadow behind Maytree Cottage, and the roadway gate was usually kept chained and padlocked. Ray was the first to see the car tracks, and then he found that the gate was open and the broken chain lay in the muddy roadway. Running out into the road, he saw that the tracks turned to the right. We had better search the garden first to make absolutely sure, father, he said. I will arouse some of the cottagers and get them to help. By the time he came back to the house, John Bennet had made a thorough search of the garden and the house, but the girl had disappeared. Go down to the town and telephone Gordon, he said, and his voice was strangely calm. In a quarter of an hour, Ray Bennet jumped off his old bicycle at the door of Maytree Cottage to tell his grave news. The phone line has been cut, he said tersely. I've ordered a car to be sent up from the garage. We will try to follow the tracks. The machine had arrived when the blazing headlamps of Dick's car came into view. Gordon knew the worst before he had sprung to the ground. There was a brief unemotional consultation. Dick went rapidly through the kitchen and followed the tracks until they came back to their road, to find Elk going slowly along the opposite side, examining the ground with an electric lamp. There's a small wheel track over here, he said. Too heavy for a bicycle, too light for a car. Looks to me like a motorcycle. It was a car, said Dick briefly, and a very big one. He sent Ray and his father to the house to change, insisted on this being done before they moved a step. They came out, wrapped in mackintoshes, and leapt into the car as it was moving. For 5 miles the tracks were visible, and then they came to a village. A policeman had seen a car come through a little time ago, and a motorcyclist. Where was the cyclist? Asked Elk. He was behind about 100 yards, said the policeman. I tried to pull him up because his lamp was out, but he took no notice. They went on for another mile, and then struck the hard surface of a newly tarred road, and here all trace of the tracks was lost. Going on for a mile farther, they reached a point where the road broke into 3. 2 of these were macadamized and showed no wheel tracks, nor did the third, although it had a soft surface, offer any encouragement to follow. It is one of these 2, said Dick. We had better try the right-hand road first." The macadam lasted until they reached another village. The road was undergoing repair in the village itself, but the night watchman shook his head when Dick asked him. "No, sir. No car has passed here for 2 hours." "We must drive back," said Dick, despair in his heart, and the car spun round and flew at top speed to the juncture of the roads. Down this they went, and they had not gone far before Dick half leapt at the sight of the red tail lamp of the machine ahead. His hopes, however, were fated to be dashed. The car had broken down on the side of the road, but the disgruntled driver was able to give them valuable information. A car had passed him 3/4 of an hour before. He described it minutely, had even been able to distinguish its make. The cyclist was driving a red Indian. Again the cyclist. How far was he behind the car? "A good 100 yards, I should say," was the reply. From now on they received frequent news of the car, but at the second village the motorcyclist had not been seen, nor at subsequent places where the machine had been identified was there any reference to a motorcyclist. It was past midnight when they came up with the machine they were chasing. It stood outside a garage on the Shoreham Road, and Elk was the first to reach it. It was empty and unattended. Inside the garage, the owner of that establishment was busy making room for the last comer. "Yes, sir, 1/4 of an hour ago," he said, when Elk had produced his authority. The chauffeur said he was going to find lodgings in the town. With the aid of a powerful electric lamp, they made an examination of the car's interior. There was no doubt whatever that Ella had been an inmate. A little ivory pin which John Bennett had given her on her birthday was found, broken, in a corner of the floor. "It is not worth while looking for the chauffeur," said Elk. "Our only chance is that he'll come back to the garage." The local police were called into consultation. "Shoreham is a very big place," said the police chief. "If you had luck, you might find your man immediately. If he's with a gang of crooks, it is more likely you'll not find him at all, or that he'll never come back for the machine." One matter puzzled Elk more than any other. It was the disappearance of the motorcyclist. If the story was true, that he had been riding 100 yards behind, and that he had fallen out between 2 villages, they must have passed him. There were a few cottages on the road, into which he might have turned, but Elk dismissed this possibility. "We had better go back," he said. "It is fairly certain that Miss Bennet has been taken out somewhere on the road. The motorcyclist is now the best clue, because she evidently went with him. This cyclist was either the frog or one of his men." "They disappeared somewhere between Shoreham and Morby," said Dick. "You know the country about here, Mr. Bennet. Is there any place where they'd be likely to go near Morby?" "I know the country," agreed Bennet, "and I've been trying to think. There is nothing but a very few houses outside of Morby. Of course, there is Morby Fields, but I can't imagine Ella being taken there." "What are Morby Fields?" asked Dick, as the car went slowly back the way it had come. "Morby Fields is a disused quarry. The company went into liquidation some years ago," replied Bennet. They passed through Morby at snail pace, stopping at the local policeman's house for any further news which might have been gleaned in their absence. There was, however, nothing fresh. "You are perfectly certain that you did not see the motorcyclist?" "I am quite certain, sir," said the man. "The car was as close to me as I am to you. In fact, I had to step to the pavement to prevent myself being splashed with mud, and there was no motorcyclist. In fact, the impression I had was that the car was empty." "Why did you think that?" asked Elk quickly. "It was riding light, for one thing, and the chauffeur was smoking for another. I always associate a smoking chauffeur with an empty car." "Son," said the admiring Elk, "there are possibilities about you," and a recruit to headquarters was noted. "I am inclined to agree with that village policeman," said Dick, when they walked back to their machine. "The car was empty when it came through here, and that accounts for the absence of the motorcyclist. It is between Morby and Welland that we've got to look." And now they moved at a walking pace. The brackets that held the headlamps were wrenched round to throw a light upon the ditch and hedge on either side of the road. They had not gone 500 yards when Elk roared, "Stop!" and jumped into the roadway. He was gone a few minutes, and then he called Dick, and the 3 men went back to where the detective was standing, looking at a big red motorcycle that stood under the shelter of a crumbling stone wall. They had passed it without observation, for its owner had chosen the other side of the wall, and it was only the gleam of the light on a handlebar which showed just above its screen that had led to its detection. Dick ran to the car and backed it so that the wall and the machine were visible. The cycle was almost new. It was splattered with mud, and its acetylene headlamps were cold to the touch. Elk had an inspiration. At the back of the seat was a heavy tool wallet, attached by a firm strap, and this he began to unfasten. If this is a new machine, the maker will have put the name and address of the owner in his wallet, he said. Presently the tool bag was detached, and Elk unstrapped the last fastening and turned back the flap. "Great Moses," said Elk. Neatly painted on the undressed leather was Joshua Broad, 6 Caverly House, Cavendish Square. End of chapter 40. Chapter 41 of The Fellowship of the Frog by Edgar Wallace. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 41. In Quarry House. The first impression that Ella Bennet had when she returned to the kitchen to fasten the door that shut off the sitting room was that the tea-cloth, which she had hung up to dry on the line near the lofty ceiling, had fallen. With startling suddenness she was enveloped in the folds of a heavy musty cloth. And then an arm was flung around her, a hand covered her mouth and drew back her head. She tried to scream, but no sound came. She kicked out toward the door, and an arm clutched at her dress and pulled back her foot. She heard the sound of something tearing, and then a strap was put round her ankles. She felt the rush of the cold air as the door was opened, and in another second she was in the garden. "Walk," hissed a voice, and she discovered her feet were loosened. She could see nothing, only she could feel the rain beating down upon the cloth that covered her head, and the strength of the wind against her face. It blew the cloth so tightly over her mouth and nose that she could hardly breathe. Where they were taking her she could only guess. It was not until she felt her feet squelch in liquid mud that she knew she was in the lane by the side of the house. She had hardly identified the place before she was lifted bodily into the waiting car. She heard somebody scrambling in by her side, and the car jerked forward. Then, with dexterous hand, one of the men sitting at her side whisked the cloth from her head. Ahead, in one of the 2 bucket seats, the only one occupied, was a dark figure, the face of which she could not see. "What are you doing? Who are you?" she asked. And no sooner did the voice of the man before her come to her ears than she knew she was in the power of the frog. "I'm going to give you your last chance," he said. "After tonight, that chance is gone." She composed the tremor in her voice with an effort, and then, "What do you mean by my last chance?" she asked. "You will undertake to marry me, and to leave the country with me in the morning. I've such faith in you that I will take your word," he said. She shook her head until she realized that in the darkness he could not see her. "I will never do that," she answered quietly, and no other word was spoken through the journey. Once, at a whispered word from the man in the mask, she saw the reflection of his mica eyepieces even though the blinds were drawn. As the car went through some village street, one of the men looked back through the glass in the hood. "Nothing," he said. No violence was offered to her. She was not bound or restricted in any way, though she knew it was perfectly hopeless for her to dream of escape. They were running along a dark country road when the car slowed and stopped. The passengers turned out quickly. She was the last. A man caught her arm as she descended and led her through an opening of the hedge into what seemed to her to be a plowed field. The other came after her, bringing her an oilskin coat and helping her into it. The rain flogged across the waist, rattling against the oilcoat. She heard the man holding her arm mutter something under his breath. The frog walked ahead, only looking back once. She slipped and stumbled, and would have often fallen but for the hand which held her up. "Where are you taking me?" she asked at last. There was no reply. She wondered if she could wrench herself free and trust to the cover of darkness to hide her. But even as the thought occurred, she saw a gleam of water to the right, a round ghostly patch. "These are Morby Fields," she said suddenly, recognizing the place. "You're taking me to the quarry." Again no answer. They tramped on doggedly until she knew they were within measurable distance of the quarry itself. She wondered what would be her fate when she finally refused, as she would refuse. Did this terrible man intend to kill her? "Wait," said the frog suddenly, and disappeared into the gloom. Then she saw a light, which came from a small wooden house, 2 patches of light, one long, one square, a window and a door. The window disappeared as he closed the shutter. Then his figure stood silhouetted in the doorway. "Come," he said, and she went forward. At the door of the hut she drew back, but the hand on her arm tightened. She was pushed into the interior, and the door was slammed and bolted. She was alone with the frog. Curiosity overcame her fear. She looked round the little room. It was about 10 feet long by 6 feet broad. The furnishings were simple: a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a fireplace. The wooden floor was covered by an old and grimy rug. Against one of the walls were piled 2 shallow wooden boxes, and the wood was new. The mask followed the direction of her eyes, and she heard his slow chuckle. "Money," he said tersely. "Your money and my money. There is $1 million there." She looked, fascinated. Near the boxes were 4 long glass cylinders, containing an opaque substance or liquid. She could not tell from where she stood. The nature of this the frog did not then trouble to explain. "Sit down," he said. His manner was brisk and businesslike. She expected him to take off his mask as he seated himself opposite her, but in this she was disappointed. He sat, and through the mica pieces she saw his hard eyes watching her. "Well, Ella Bennet, what do you say? Will you marry me, or will you go into a welcome oblivion? You leave this hut either as my wife, or we leave together, dead." He got up and went to where the glass cylinders lay and touched one. "I will smash one of these with my foot and take off my mask, and you shall have at least the satisfaction that you know who I am before you die, but only just before you die." She looked at him steadily. "I will never marry you," she said. "Never! If for no other reason, for your villainous plot against my brother." "Your brother is a fool," said the hollow voice. "He need never have gone through that agony. If you had only promised to marry me. I had a man ready to confess. I myself would have taken the risk of supporting his confession." "Why do you want to marry me?" she asked. It sounded banal, stupid, yet so grotesque was the suggestion that she could talk of the matter in cold blood and almost without emotion. "Because I love you," was the reply. "Whether I love you as Dick Gordon loves you, I do not know. It may well be that you are something which I cannot possess, and therefore are all the more precious to me. I have never been thwarted in any desire." "I would welcome death," she said quickly, and she heard the muffled chuckle. "There are worse things than death to a sensitive woman," he said significantly, "and you shall not die until the end." He did not attempt to speak again, but pulling a pack of cards from his pocket, played solitaire. After an hour's play, he swept the cards into the fireplace and rose. He looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that froze her blood. "Perhaps you will never see my face," he said, and reached out his hand to the oil lamp which stood on the table. Lower and lower sank the flame, and then came a gentle tap at the door. Tap, tap, tappity, tap. The frog stood still, his hand upon the lamp. Tap, tap, tappity, tap. It came again. He turned up the light a little and went to the door. "Who's that?" he asked. "Hagen," said a deep voice, and the frog took a startled step backward. "Quick, open!" The mask turned the heavy bar, and taking a key from his pocket, he drew back the lock. "Hagen, how did you get away?" The door was pushed open with such violence that he was flung back against the wall, and Ella uttered a scream of joy. Standing in the doorway was a bare-headed man in a shining trench coat. It was Joshua Broad. "Keep back!" He did not look round, but she knew the words were addressed to her and stood stock still. Both Broad's hands were in the deep pockets of his coat. His eyes did not leave the mask. "Harry," he said softly, "you know what I want." "Take yours!" screeched the frog. His hand moved so quickly that the girl could not follow it. 2 shots rang out together, and the frog staggered back against the wall. His foot was within a few inches of the glass cylinders, and he raised it. Again Broad fired, and the frog fell backward, his head in the fireplace. He came struggling to his feet, and then, with a little choking sob, fell backward, his arms outstretched. There was a sound of voices outside, a scraping of feet on the muddy path, and John Bennett came into the hut. In a moment the girl was in his arms. Broad looked round. Elk and Dick Gordon were standing in the doorway, taking in the scene. "Gentlemen," said Joshua Broad, "I call you to witness that I killed this man in self-defense." "Who is it?" said Dick. "It is the frog," said Joshua Broad calmly. "His other name is Harry Lime. He is an English convict." "I knew it was Harry Lime." It was Elk who spoke. "Is he dead?" Broad stooped and thrust his hand under the man's waistcoat. "Yes, he is dead," he announced simply. "I'm sorry that I have robbed you of your prey, Mr. Elk, but it was vitally necessary that he should be killed before I was. And one of us had to die this night." Elk knelt by the still figure and began to unfasten a hideous rubber mask. "It was here that Genter was killed," said Dick Gordon in a low voice. "Do you see the gas?" Elk looked at the gas cylinders and nodded. Then his eyes came back to the bare-headed American. "Saul Morris, I believe," he said, and Joshua Broad nodded. Elk pursed his lips thoughtfully, and his eyes went back to the still figure at his feet. "Now, Frog, let me see you," he said, and tore away the mask. He looked down into the face of philosopher Johnson. End of chapter 40. Chapter 42 of The Fellowship of the Frog by Edgar Wallace. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 42. Joshua Broad Explains. The sunlight was pouring through the windows of Maytree Cottage. Their breakfast things still stood upon the table when the American began his story. "My name, as you rightly surmised, Mr. Elk, is Saul Morris. I am, by all moral standards, a criminal, though I have not been guilty of any criminal practice for the past 10 years. I was born at Hertford in Connecticut. I am not going to offer you an apology, conventional or unconventional, for my ultimate choice, nor will I insult your intelligence by inviting sympathy for my first fall. I guess I was born with light fingers and a desire for money that I had not earned. I was not corrupted, I was not tempted, I had no evil companions. In fact, the beginnings of my career were singularly unlike any of the careers of criminals which I have ever read. I studied bank robberies as a doctor might take up the study of anatomy. I understand perfectly every system of banking, and there are only two, one of which succeeds, the other produces a plentiful crop of fraudulent directors, and I have added to this a knowledge of lockcraft. A burglar who starts business without understanding the difficulties and obstacles he has to overcome is, to use the parallel I have already employed, like the doctor who starts off to operate without knowing what arteries, tissues, and nerves he will be severing. The difference between a surgeon and a butcher is that one doesn't know the name of the tissues he is cutting. When I decided upon my career, I served for 5 years in the factory of the greatest English safe maker in Wolverhampton. I studied locks, safes, the tensile qualities of steel, until I was proficient, and my spare time I gave up to as important a study, the transportation of negotiable currency. That in itself is a study which might well occupy a man's full time. I returned to America at the age of 25 and accumulated a kit of tools, which cost me several $1,000s, and with these, and alone, I smashed the 9th National Bank, getting away on my first attempt with $300,000. I will not give you a long list of my many crimes. Some of them I have conveniently forgotten. Others are too unimportant and contain too many disappointments to tell you in detail. It is sufficient to say that there is no proof, other than my word, that I was responsible for any of these depredations. My name has only been associated with one, the robbery of the strong room on the Mantegna. In 1898, I learnt that the Mantegna was carrying to France 55 million francs in paper currency. The money was packed in 2 stout wooden cases, and before being packed, was submitted to hydraulic pressure in order to reduce the bulk. In one case were 35 packets, each containing 1,000 mil notes, and in the second case 20 packets. I particularly want you to remember that there were 2 cases, because you will understand a little better what happened subsequently. It was intended that the ship should call at a French port, I think it was Havre, because the transatlantic boats in those days did not call at Cherbourg. I had made all my plans for getting away with this stuff, and the robbery had actually been committed and the boxes were in my cabin trunk, substitute boxes of an exact shape having been left in the strong room of the Mantegna, when to my dismay we lost a propeller blade whilst off the coast of Ireland, and the captain of the Mantegna decided to put into Southampton without making the French port. A change of plans, to a man of my profession, is almost as embarrassing as a change of plan in the middle of a battle. I had on this occasion an assistant, a man who afterwards died in delirium tremens. It was absolutely impossible to work alone. The job was too big, and my assistant was a man I had every reason to trust. "Harry Lyme?" suggested Elk. Joshua Broad shook his head. "No, you're wrong. I will not tell you his name. The man is dead, and he was a very faithful and loyal fellow, though inclined to booze, a weakness which I never shared. However, the reason we were so embarrassed was that, had we gone ashore at the French port, the robbery in the strong room would not have been discovered, because it was unlikely that the purser would go to the strong room until the ship was in Southampton water. I had fixed everything, the passing of my bags through the customs being the most important. This change meant that we must improvise a method to get ashore at Southampton before the hue and cry was raised, and if possible before the robbery was discovered, though it did not seem possible that we should succeed. Fortunately, there was a fog in the Solent, and we had to go dead slow, and if you remember the circumstances, as the Mantegna came up the Solent, she collided with a steam dredger that was going into Portsmouth. The dredger's foremast became entangled in the bowsprit of the Mantegna, and it was some time before they were extricated. It was then that I seized my opportunity. From an open portway on my deck, where we were waiting with our baggage, ready to land, we were level with the side of the dredger as she swung round under the impact. I flung the two grips that held the boxes onto the dredger's deck, and I and my friend jumped together. As I say, a fog lay on the water, and we were not seen, and not discovered by the crew of the dredger until we had parted company with the Mantegna. And although the story we told to the dredger's captain was the thinnest imaginable, namely that we thought it was a tender that had come off to collect us, he very readily accepted it, and the $20 bill which I gave him. We made Portsmouth after a great deal of difficulty late in the evening. There was no customs inspection, and we got our bags safely on land. I intended staying the night at Portsmouth, but after we had taken our lodgings, my friend and I went round to a little bar to get a drink, and there we heard something which sent us back to our rooms at full pelt. What we heard was that the robbery had been discovered, and that the police were looking for two men who had made their escape on the dredger. As it was the dredger's captain who had recommended our lodgings, I had little expectation of getting into the room and out again without capture. However, we did, and as we passed out of the street at one end, the police came in at the other. I carried one bag, my friend the lighter, and we started on foot across country, and before the morning we had reached a place called Eastleigh. It was to Eastleigh, you will remember, Mr. Elk, that I came when I left the cattle boat during the war and suddenly changed my character from a hard-up cattle puncher to a wealthy gambler at Monte Carlo. That matter I will explain later. When we reached Eastleigh, I had a talk with my companion, and it was a pretty straight talk, because he got a load of liquor on board and was becoming more and more unreliable. It ended by his going into the town to buy some food and not returning. When I went in search of him, I found him lying in the street, incapably drunk. There was nothing to do but leave him, and getting a little food, I took the two bags and struck the road. The bags, however, were much too heavy for me, and I had to consider my position. Standing by the road was an old cottage, and on a board was an announcement that it was to be sold. I took the address. It was the name of a Winchester lawyer, and then I got over the fence and made an inspection of the ground, to find that at the lower end of the rank garden was an old disused well, boarded over by rotten planks. I could safely drop the lighter of my burdens down the well and cover it up with the rubble, of which there was plenty around. I might have buried both. In many ways a lot of trouble would have been saved if I had. But I was loath to leave all that I had strived for with such care and pains, and I took the second box on with me, reached Winchester, bought a change of clothing, and spent a comfortable day there, interviewing the lawyer who owned the cottage. I had some English money with me, and the purchase was effected. I gave strict instructions that the place was not to be let in any circumstances, and that it was to remain as it was until I came back from Australia. I posed as a wealthy Australian who was repurchasing the house in which he was born. From Winchester I reached London, never dreaming that I was in any danger. My companion had given me the name of an English crook, an acquaintance of his, who he said was the finest safe man in Europe, a man who was called Lime, and who, I discovered many years after, was the same Harry Lime. He told me Lime would help me in any emergency. And that emergency soon arose. The first man I saw when I put my foot on the platform at Waterloo was the purser of the Mantegna, and with him was the ship's detective. I dodged back, and fortunately for me, there was a suburban train leaving from the opposite platform, and I went on to Surbiton, reaching London by another route. Afterwards, I learnt that my companion had been arrested, and in his half-drunken state had told all he knew. The thing to do now was to cash the remainder of the money, 35 million francs. I immediately thought of Harry Lime. I have never suffered from the illusion that there is honor amongst thieves. My own experience is that that is one of the most stupid of proverbs. But I thought that at least I might make it worth Lime's while to help me out of a mess. I learned from the newspapers that there was a special force of police looking for me, and that they were watching the houses of well-known criminals, to whom they thought I might gravitate. At first I thought this was a bluff, but I was to discover that this was not the case. I reached Lime's house in a disreputable thoroughfare in Camden Town. The fog was thick and yellow, and I had some difficulty in finding my way. It was a small house in a mean, squalid street, and at first I could get no reply to my knocking. Then the door was opened cautiously. "Is that Lime?" I asked. "He's not at home," said a man, and he would have shut the door, but my instinct told me this was the fellow I was seeking, and I put my foot in the way of the closing door. "Come in," he said at last, and led the way into a small room, the only light of which was a lantern which stood on the table. The room was thick with fog, for the window was open, as I learnt afterwards, to allow Lime to make his escape. "Are you the American?" he asked. "You're mad to come here. The police have been watching this place ever since this afternoon." I told him briefly what my difficulty was. "I have here 35 million francs. That's £1,300,000, said I, "and there's enough for both of us. Can you plant this whilst I make a getaway?" "Yes, I will," he said. "What do I get out of it?" "I'll give you half," I promised, and he seemed to be satisfied with that. I was surprised that he spoke in the voice and tone of an educated man, and I learnt afterwards that he had also been intended for some profession, and like myself had chosen the easier way. Now, you'll not believe me when I tell you that I did not see his face, and that I carried no very vivid impression away with me. This is due to the fact that I concentrated my attention upon the frog which was tattooed on his wrist, and which afterwards, at great expense, he succeeded in having removed by a Spanish doctor at Valladolid, who specialized in that kind of work. That frog was tattooed a little askew, and I knew, and he knew too, that whether I remembered his face or not, he had a mark which was certain to guide me back to him. The arrangement I made was that when I got back to America, I should send a cable to him at an address we agreed upon, and that he was then to send me by registered post to the Grand Hotel Montreal a half of the money he had in the box. To cut a long story short, I made my escape, and eventually reached the continent by way of Hook of Holland, encumbered with any baggage that would have been impossible. In due course I left for the United States from Bremen, Germany, and immediately on my arrival sent the cable to Lyme and went up to Montreal to await the arrival of the money. It did not come. I cabled again. Still it did not come. It was months after that I learnt what had happened. It came from the cutting of a newspaper saying that Lyme had been drowned on his way to Guernsey. How he sent that, I don't know and never have inquired. Lyme was, in fact, very much alive. He had some $6 million worth of French notes, and his job was to negotiate them. His first step was to move to a Midland town, where for 6 months he posed as a man of business, in the meantime changing his whole appearance, shaving off his mustache and producing an artificial baldness by the application of some chemical. Whilst he was doing this, and determined that every penny he had taken from me he would hold, he decided to make assurance doubly sure, and started in a small way the Fellowship of the Frog. The object of this was to spread the mark of identification by which I should know him as far and wide as possible. He may have had no other idea in his mind, and probably had not, but to broadcast this mark of the frog, a little askew, the exact replica of his. Obviously, no class would be willing to suffer the tortures of tattooing for nothing. So began this curious benefit fund of his. From this little beginning grew the great frog organization. Almost one of the first men he came into contact with was an old criminal named Maitland, a man who could neither read nor write. There was a gasp. "Why, of course," said Il, and smacked his knee impatiently. "That is the explanation of the baby." "There never was a baby," smiled Broad. "The baby was Maitland himself, learning to write. The clothes of the baby, which were planted for your special benefit in the Elder Street house, were put there by Johnson. The toys for the baby were inventions to keep you guessing. There never was a baby. Once he had Maitland properly coached, he came to London, and Maitland's Consolidated was formed. Maitland had nothing to do except to sit around and look picturesque. His alleged clerk, one of the cleverest actors I have ever met, was the real head of the business, and remained Maitland's clerk just as long as it suited him. When he thought suspicion was veering toward him, he had himself dismissed, just as when he thought you had identified him with the frog, he made one of his men shoot at him with a blank cartridge in Harley Terrace. He was the real Maitland. In the meantime, the frog organization was growing, and he sat down to consider how best he could use the society for his advantage. Money was going out, and he naturally hated to see it go. New recruits were appearing every day, and they all cost money. But what he did get from this rabble were one or two brilliant minds. Balder was one, Hagen was one, and there were others who perhaps will now never be known. As the controlling force of Maitland's Consolidated, he had not the slightest difficulty in disposing of his francs. And then he set Maitland speculating in other directions, and when his speculations were failing, he found ways of cutting his loss. He was once caught short in a wool transaction. The frog maimed the only man who could have ruined him. Whenever he found it expedient for the benefit of himself to club a man, whether he was a military attaché or a very plain city merchant speculating in his own stocks, Johnson never hesitated. People who were bothering him were put beyond the opportunities of mischief. He made one great mistake. He allowed Maitland to live like a hog in a house he had bought. That was folly. When he found that the old man had been trailed, he shifted him to Berkeley Square, got him tailored, and eventually murdered him for daring to go to Horsham. I saw the murderer escape, for I was on the roof when the shots were fired. Incidentally, I had a narrow escape myself. But to return to my own narrative. 5 years ago I was broke, and I decided to have another attempt to get my money. And there was also the fact that a very large sum of money waited reclaiming at Eastleigh, always providing that I had not been identified as the man who bought the house. It took me a long time before I made absolutely certain that I was unknown, and then, with the title deeds in my pocket, I sailed on a cattle boat and landed, as you have said, Mr. Elk, with a few dollars in my pocket at Southampton. I went straight to the house, which was now in a shocking state of repair, and there I made myself as comfortable as I possibly could, whilst, night after night, I toiled in the well to recover the small box of money, amounting to a very considerable sum. When this was recovered, I left for Paris, and the rest, so far as my public history is concerned, you know. I then began my search for Frog, and I very soon saw that if I depended upon the identification of the tattoo marks, my search was hopeless. Naturally, when I discovered, as I soon did, that Maitland was a frog, I narrowed my search to that office. I discovered that Maitland was an illiterate by the simple expedient of stopping him in the street one day near his house and showing him an envelope on which I had written, "You are a fake," and asking him if he knew the address. He pointed to a house farther along the street and hurried in. I knew that Maitland could neither read nor write when I learnt that the children's clothes had been left at Eldor Street, said Dick, and from that moment I knew that Johnson was the frog. Joshua Broad nodded. That, I think, is about all I have to say. Johnson was a genius. The way he handled that huge organization, which he ran practically in his spare time when he was away from the office, was a revelation. He drew everybody into his net, and yet nobody knew him. Alder was a godsend. He was perhaps the highest paid agent of the lot. You will find that his income ran into 6 figures. When Joshua Broad had gone back to London, Dick walked with Elk to the garden gate. I shan't be coming up for a little while, he said. I never expected you would, said Elk. Say, Captain Gordon, what happened to those 2 wooden boxes that were in the quarry hut last night? I didn't see the boxes. I saw them, said Elk, nodding. They were there when we took Miss Bennet away, and when I came back with the police they were gone, and Joshua Broad was there all the time, he added. They looked at one another. I don't think I should inquire too closely into that matter, said Dick. I owe Broad something. I owe him a bit too, said Elk with a hint of enthusiasm. Do you know, he taught me a rhyme last night? There are about 150 verses, but I only know 4. It starts, William the Conqueror started his tricks, Battle of Hastings, 1066. That's a grand rhyme, Captain Gordon. If I'd only known that 10 years ago, I might have been a chief commissioner by now. He walked down the road towards the station, for he was returning by tram. The sun glittered upon the rain-fringed banners of the hollyhocks that filled the cottagers' gardens. Then from the hedge a tiny green figure hopped, and Elk stood still and watched it. The little reptile looked round and eyed the detective with black, staring eyes. Frog, Elk raised a reproachful finger. Have a heart and go home. This is not your day. And as if he understood what the man had said, the frog leaped back to the shelter of the long grass. End of chapter 42. End of The Fellowship of the Frog by Edgar Wallace.